Chapter 22 of Citadel of Fear by Gertrude Barrows Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Citadel of Fear, Chapter 22. A Herder of Goblins. Cullen was ready, but in thinking that his death was planned at the jaws of that frightful beast, he had misjudged his captor. Stepping forward, Reed intervened his own person between the flame-eyed brute and its purposed victim. Uttering a sharp command, he waved it back. With that left hand of his, that Cullen saw very clearly now was covered with a bulky white fur glove. The beast's jaws opened wider in a soundless snarl. Then, with a cringing motion, it whirled, leapt, and vanished in the swamp like the gaunt phantom of hunger it resembled. Reed turned. "They know their master, eh, O'Hara?" "It seems so." Cullen eyed him sternly. "What sort of goblin den is it you have here?" "Goblins. Your Celtic superstition deprives me of credit. What you see is my work, all mine. No supernatural bogey or god or demon lent any help to the creation of these dainty pets. They are mine, the children of my unaided hand and brain. Do you doubt me?" He put the interrogation with an explosive insistence that puzzled Cullen. When he spoke of the workroom as a goblin den, he had used the term in a hyperbolic sense. Despite everything, his preconception of Reed as an experimenter in freak zoology had kept the supernatural from his thoughts, and not even his experience with the luminous, blood-sucking gatekeeper had changed this view. In the steaming jungles between Capricorn and Cancer, he had seen creatures as strange and loathsome. Such a one had Reed found, no doubt, brought it here, and fed it daintily till it throve past the size of its tropical fellows. And he had taken it for granted that the frightful, starved-looking brutes thronging this den were the misbred abortions of more natural beasts. But Reed's words had an effect contrary to their meaning. As if with new vision, Cullen scanned the fetid breeding ground. The feline brute had hidden itself, but a number of its fellows were distinct in all their grotesquerie. From the pale blob of a thing that lurched past on a bunch of tentacle-like legs, to a creature so buried in mire that only its bony head lay on the surface like the yellowed skull of a horse, all were hideous. But nature herself makes many loathsome forms. It was not their ugliness that enlightened Cullen. It was their eyes. Venomous, intelligent, unforgettable, that which looked through them was far removed from the innocent ferocity of wild beasts. They were goblins. And turning from them to their master, he saw in Reed's glance that same stare of naked, demoniacal hate that was in the eyes of his creatures. At Green Gables, a white-haired man paced restlessly up and down the library, and as he walked, there poured from his lips the pent-up stream of a story so terrible, and at the same time so incredible, that he had dared to tell it to no man before. And in this he was right, for in all America there were but 2 living men who would have believed. Anthony Rhodes was not one of them, but it was not to Rhodes that he was talking. That level-headed young lawyer sat by the table, toying with a paperweight and wondering if there was any risk that the second lunatic he had entertained might become dangerously violent. That the second lunatic claimed to be the father of the first made the tale no more credible. Rhodes could only think of the beautiful Miss Reed with pity, but he saw no reason why he should be called upon to tolerate her equally mad relatives. Perhaps had Rhodes either shared in the fragmentary confidence bestowed by Cullen on his return from Mexico in June, or stood behind a bulging door and watched the white claw of a demon rip through its panels, his credulity might have been greater. To Cleona had been both these experiences. It was to her that the white-haired man talked, and whether Tony were convinced or not bothered her very little just now. In fact, for once Cleona was not thinking of Tony. She was listening with the keenest and most lively attention to the story of Sven Bjornson, once advisor to the Council of Sacred Guilds in Tlapallan, now a homeless wanderer trailing an unnameable horror across the earth. It was a trail he had lost very soon after it entered the United States. Only the chance that guided his wanderings to this city had also ordained that he reach there in time to read of the latest ravages at Carpentier. In June he had been on the western coast, whither the purely local excitement over that earlier mystery had never traveled. And yet it had been on some such incident as this bungalow affair that Bjornson had relied to pick up the trail again. "I knew," he said, "that its ambition had become impatient, that strange, bad events must soon happen because of it." "I was sure," said Cleona, "that the thing which came to my door that night had no natural origin." "Madness. Pure madness," muttered Rhodes, playing with the paperweight and wondering if it would be worse for Cleona's nerves to put the stranger out now or let him go on talking till he began to get dangerous. "I saw your brother's name in this morning's account," continued Bjornson, "and a reference to what happened in June. I looked that up in the old files at the Daily Record once, and then I knew. From what I have already told you, you can imagine how wild with anxiety I have been to find them, and the thing they took, I should almost say that escaped with them from Tlapallan. I went straight to Carpentier. I suppose your brother was too disturbed and preoccupied to recognize me, and—" he laughed shortly. "Mr. O'Hara is not a person who is easily stopped when he happens to be in a hurry. By the way, the fact is, when your brother does recognize me, he may not exactly meet me with open arms. There was a thing I neglected to tell you. At our last parting, I did him a very great wrong. That was 15 years ago, but it was not the kind of wrong that a man forgets." Bjornson paused somewhat drearily. In spite of his anxiety to find Cullen, enlist his help, and get from him any information he might have acquired, he rather dreaded that moment of recognition. "Cullen's probably forgotten it," said Cleona abstractedly. "He never bears malice long." Her mind was running back over the man's narrative. "I tell you, Mr. Bjornson, there can be no question at all. This Reed man, with his hints to Cullen of strange beasts, with his albino servant, and his daughter, who's so lovely and strange and claims to be no daughter of his, the three of them fit to a T with what you've been hunting. For the black god you speak of, I do not know. Cullen said nothing to me of seeing any such carved stone demon out there, and the poor girl, I am afraid we gave her little chance to tell us of anything." "You meant well. Oh, I know by your face and your manner and your sympathetic comprehension you meant well. You say she seemed in good health, only very mournful. Mournful. How can I make up to her for this last year? I had never thought to be glad for my dear wife's death. But I thank God now that Astrid passed in peace, with the child she loved at her side, to be mourned by many friends. Yes, I am glad she passed before that red night came to Tlapallan. But our poor child. Let me find her again. Only let me find her. This won't do." Bjornson halted and visibly straightened both in spirit and body. "Personal ties," he said sternly, "have a compelling grip, but my duty lies first in another direction. Mr. Rhodes, do you realize that we have to save the world from an invasion atrocious beyond credence? I don't think it has begun yet. I believe, I hope, that we are in time to smother the thing in its infancy." The priests of Nakak-Yaotl knew the danger. They were very careful to restrict the power they had of it to one certain channel. But it is free now, free, loose in the world with its chosen servants. You may think me mad if you like, but I swear to you that there is, life in that dreadful carved black stone called Nakak-Yaotl. A life that is ambitious and vile, and that chose these vile men I have told you of for the agents of its fiendish ambition. And it has an enmity against the human race, an enmity darker and vaster than human enmity could ever be. Can you believe, child, that there are gods of old who still live? Old gods and powers that have survived the passing of their worshippers? I can the easier believe in your demon, Cleona said, "for the sake of that which came to my door one night. Now, do you really think, Mr. Bjornson, that it was the porcelain image Cullen brought me from Mexico that drew the bad luck to our bungalow?" "I do indeed." "Then I have no doubt you are right. And I think 'tis in Reed's house at Undine that you'll find the lair of the evil spirit you are seeking." "Cleona! Rhodes!" ejaculated Tony, getting to his feet at last and shocked beyond measure by the whole conversation. "Cleona O'Hara Rhodes," she corrected him with a sidelong flash of very much excited blue eyes. "There are things that we Irish are quicker to understand than the rest of the world. You keep out of this, Tony." End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Citadel of Fear by Gertrude Barrows Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Citadel of Fear. Chapter 23. The Lord of Fear. "Look about you," said Reed. "Before I carry out my purpose, there is much for you to see and hear." Though in Cullen's opinion he had already seen a trifle more than enough, he obeyed Reed's gesture and glanced behind him. After a moment he turned back. "That is not strange," he said wearily. "That the old black devil himself should preside here is just the most natural thing in the world, Mr. Reed." For some reason Reed's sneering face flooded with angry color. "I preside here," he snapped. "Stand up and turn around, quick, or you'll find a devil in me really to be dreaded." But though Cullen might be foolish enough to believe in demons, he was not a man easily overawed by one. "If you wish me to stand," he said quietly, "you'll have to be either untying me or helping me up. That leech thing of yours has not left me in just a pink of condition." To feign a greater weakness than he felt was elementary strategy, but to his disgust not much feigning was required. It was all he could do to get on his feet, with Reed's rather grudging assistance, and once up he found himself very wavery and with a painful tendency to buckle at the knees. No sooner was he up than he sat down again, but this time on a chair carved, so near as he could tell, from virgin gold. One does not expect to find solid gold furniture in the midst of a swamp, but neither is it unusual to find a swamp full of fiends in the heart of an old colonial residence. Being past surprise, Cullen viewed his surroundings with interest and let it go at that. The space immediately beneath the shaft, whose square was some 25 feet in diameter, had been floored with cement, on a higher level than the marsh, but sweating with dampness from the general moisture. 3 sides were open to the swamp, but the 4th was a wall, flush with the side of the shaft above it and pierced by a single broad, high doorway. On the cement floor were ranged a number of objects, which, like the chair, seemed to be of astonishing value and entirely out of place. Jars and vessels of massive gold were set about at hazard. Close to Cullen there stood a great lidless chest or box. Its apparent value would have capitalized a bank, but into it there had been tumbled a heap of shabby, common things, some dirt-encrusted overalls, an old pair of canvas trousers, and the like. A steel spade had been flung in among them so carelessly that its blade had chipped off a long, curling flake of gold. 3 solid gold cougars supporting a 6-foot basin, like a baptismal font, were impressive, but a stained rubber apron draped over one cougar's head rather spoiled the effect. The only thing here which Cullen considered absolutely and completely appropriate was the squat, polished black statue that crouched on a small dais beneath a canopy of black, with 5 candles burning on either side of it, set on the prongs of 2 golden candelabra. No evil could be too vile for that ugliest of images to grin at. The head, particularly the mouth, might have been compared to a humanized toad, save that a toad, for all its lack of pulchritude, has a certain honesty of expression. The sculptor of that image had not stopped at frank ugliness. Alert stealth was in the very distension of its nostrils. The eyes were slits, but they were watchful slits. The mouth grinned, but it was a tense, cruel grin that had never heard of humor. With long, treacherous fingers clasped around its knees, the thing squatted naked, having none of those adornments with which religion, barbarous or otherwise, symbolizes the attributes of its deity. The being represented had but one purpose and one end, and of that the face alone was an adequate symbol. As Colin looked, he felt rise up in him such a wave of loathing and detestation as turned him sick. "Reed," said he, "I could forgive you the imps of your quagmire there, and I could forgive you the vile bloodsucker you loosed on me at the gate, but the sight of that black iniquity you no doubt worship I'll not forgive you. Faith, it'll haunt my dreams if I live to be 100. Again Reed flashed into resentment. "No more of that," he snarled. "I worship nothing. Do you understand me? Nothing. Good God! Are you such a blind fool that you fear a chunk of carved marble more than me? I am the Lord of Fear, not Nakak-ya-otl." "Who did you say?" A word, a name is, at the least when you stop to think of it, a potential force. At best and strongest it may have the power of magic. For Cullen the years dropped away like a falling screen. Afloat on a sea of light, he raised his eyes to a dark cliff crowned by a monstrous building, blind, pallid, oppressive in its mere appearance. "It is the seat of Nakak-ya-otl," said a girl's voice. "Nakak-ya-otl, maker of hatreds, who would destroy mankind if he could." "Nakak-ya-otl?" Reed's impatient voice reached Cullen through time and dragged him back to the present. "One phase of an old Aztec god. Lord, you look stupid when you gape like that. The years have certainly brought you no increase of intelligence, friend Boots." Cullen's mouth shut with a snap. "Archer Kennedy," he ejaculated. "It was the beard and the glasses that did it. That, and thinking you a dead man long ago. You can tell me, then, what I've been wondering about for 15 years, more or less. Was Tlapallan a real city, or did I dream it?" It is very tiresome, when one is trying to impress a man with the horror of one's malicious power, to be regarded as a mere purveyor of information. To Archer Kennedy, the distinctly impersonal nature of Cullen's first question was irritating to the point of insult. In the days of their earlier acquaintance, his chief grievance against the Irish lad had been a trick he had of ignoring him as a personality. As Chester Reed, man of mystery, Cullen had given promise of at least according him the respect of hatred. Identified as Kennedy, that old manner had instantly returned. A pinprick, of course, but this man's nature was not only malicious. Its malice was of the shallow type that resents pinpricks more than blows. "Tlapallan," he said between his teeth, "was real once, but it's nothing now. Do you know who destroyed it?" "Nakak-ya-otl?" inquired Cullen with deep interest. Rather to his amazement, the reply was a heavy blow across the mouth. "You utter dolt!" raged Kennedy. "Mention Nakak-ya-otl again, and I'll have you dragged to the middle of that swamp and left there bound for my servants to devour. I caused the ruin of Tlapallan, and I drained it first of a knowledge that makes me your master, as it will make me master of the world in my day of triumph." Cullen said nothing. The man who had struck him he remembered as too insignificant and absurd even to be seriously angry with. As for the grandiloquent claim he made, Cullen took no stock in it. But Nakak-ya-otl was another matter. From the haunting glare of the goblin creatures he looked to the slit-eyed watchfulness of that more terrible though seemingly inanimate demon, and he knew that this business was between him and them. What was it Bjornson had said before he turned him out to die, as he thought, in the desert? "To prevent a possible thing that I dare not speak of, I would condemn myself as readily as you, for I know that Nakak-ya-otl grows restive." Was this what he had meant? Had the evil power that laired in that pallid, enormous building above the lake desired a freedom greater than Tlapallan allowed? And had it achieved that desire? "There is a prophecy," the Moth Girl had said, "that someday Nakak-Yaotl will destroy Tlapallan, but I do not believe it. Quetzalcoatl, noblest of all the gods, is stronger than he." But the city that swam in a lake of light was no more. He himself had beheld the dark tarn that filled the hollow of the hills it had glorified. And Quetzalcoatl, the rival god, the image he had brought thence, twice broken and the third time utterly shattered through invasions which he now certainly knew to have emanated from this house. Cullen's imagination was racing now. It produced a dozen half-lost memories and flung them together in a most appalling pattern. And back of all the horror, a joy was hiding, a joy that in the flying confusion of his thoughts he could not at first identify. Then suddenly the pattern was set. Everything fell into order, and seated as he believed between the devil and his fiend-eyed offspring, Cullen caught the greatest joy of his life and knew the most rapturous relief. His dusk lady was not mad. Were anyone crazy, it was himself for so believing her. The strange, elfin look of her beauty, the low, musical voice that was if a thrush should speak, the fine, level courage of her, to be disconcerted neither by her own danger nor the killing of a man she loathed. Only one girl he had met in his life had shared those qualities, and though to Cullen the Moth Girl had been a pretty dream, where the Dusk Lady was an all-engrossing reality, the race resemblance was strong enough for him to have placed and understood her, had he not been such an utter and prejudiced fool. She was a child of Tlapallan, and though he doubted if her race were entirely human, that was a matter of no consequence. Hadn't an ancestor of his married an elf-woman that he met on the Bry Leith itself? And hadn't she been a good wife to him, and his own, Cullen's great-grandmother on his mother's side? Suddenly, Cullen realized that Kennedy was speaking, had been speaking, in fact, for some time. End of Chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Citadel of Fear by Gertrude Barrows Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Citadel of Fear, Chapter 24, A Lonely Traveler. Across the rough ground of an empty field 2 miles beyond Undine, a dark figure stumbled and panted beneath the unheeding stars. Once or twice it fell among the hard rows of old, dry corn stubble. One might have thought it some strayed child, lost in the night, but the figure was too tall, too slimly graceful beneath its flowing outer garment of black. It was a weary, courageous figure that had come far, far, and all the way on foot. For the bright galleys of Tlapallan were the only means of travel that slim figure knew till its time of grief, and in the one long terrible journey across the outer world it had learned little, by reason of being kept close by enemies. But to Tlapallan's children were certain birthrights. No homing pigeon could have come more sure and true than that slim, tired one that stumbled among the stubble rows. The night was not so still as it had been. A wind was rising. It blew in sudden gusts, like the breath of an invisible giant. The long cloak flapped and struggled, wrapping hinderingly about the wearer's limbs. Away to one side blazed the lights of the chateau-like farmhouse of whose acres the stubble-field was a part. The house was full of flowers, lights, and laughing people, for its owners were entertaining many guests that night. But the cloaked one was no guest of theirs. In a desperation of thwarted haste it stumbled on, as indifferent to the gay human throng in the distant house as the stars were indifferent to itself. End of Chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Citadel of Fear by Gertrude Barrows Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Citadel of Fear, Chapter 25, The White Beast Hand. And so, Kennedy was saying, being mad for the girl, and having learned that my brains were worthy of respect, Marco, or rather Markazuma to give him his full name, sold me one or two secrets that were absolutely invaluable, just for my help in winning her. Lord, if I could have got a like hold on some priests of the other guilds, the world would be at my feet now, as it shall be yet. Believe me, friend Boots, the most powerful god in Tlapallan never had a seat there, nor received any recognition. Even I was blinded for a while. O'Hara decided that his abstraction had lost the thread of a very interesting narrative. "I don't understand," he said. "Neither did I, at first. Do you remember in what agony of mind I called you to come back that night when they turned you loose and kept me a prisoner? I had seen a thing that would have made any man afraid. I had seen the transmutation, but I'll get to that later. Believe me, you'll have a very clear idea of that particular mystery before this night ends. But to get back, there was quite a while there when I was actually afraid of their trumpery stone and gold images. Aye. Then old Topiltsen, you remember Topiltsen? He was the first priest of the sacrifice to that lump of stone there." He nodded contemptuously toward the eidolon of Nakak-Yaotl. "He was the one you dropped overboard, and I nearly paid the debt, with not my life, but a fate that, as I hinted before, you will be well able to understand before I am done with you." There was an ugly and reiterated thread in the man's words, but somehow Cullen found it unimpressive. That vile, unnatural marsh, with its obscene forms and spectral eyes, was terrible enough. The squatting similitude of all evil beneath the black canopy was like the things a man sees in the dark light of delirium. But the self-styled Lord of Fear himself was not terrible at all. He was as incongruous to his surroundings as the soiled rubber apron to the golden cougar's head, or the miscellany of common trash to the golden chest that contained it. The black god of the dais, the goblins of the swamp, were loathsome but awful. Kennedy was loathsome, and inspired contempt. He was shallow, cheap, the shell of a man, empty of aught but petty egotism and a malice that had not even the redeeming dignity of greatness. Looking him in the eyes, Cullen wondered that he had a little while before seemed to see behind those round lenses the true fiend look that characterized the marsh beasts. "I wish," he said steadily, "if it's all the same to you, Mr. Kennedy, that you'll give me the straight story and be through." "You do, eh? If you knew what waits for you at the end of it. Well, to go on, old Topiltsen received a revelation in a dream that his god wished me for a temple servant. Damned fortunate revelation for me, too. I told you that I let imagination run away with me at first. I swept and carried and toiled for them in fear and trembling. Aye. Till I began to use my reason, to remember that material effects have material causes, and I saw clear to the real God behind the sham ones." "And yet you do not strike me as a religious man this minute," observed his captive thoughtfully. "You fool, I don't mean what you mean. The God I speak of is the only one of real power the world has ever known. I mean science. Those priests have a dozen secrets they took from science and gave the credit to Tanothiu and Talalok and Quetzalcoatl and Lord knows what all. And in the end they paid the penalty of all fools who cloud science with superstition and have faith in their own empty rituals. They, who might have ruled the world, turned on each other. In the terrific collision of blind forces loosed, they and their misused knowledge and Tlapallan itself simply vanished from the earth. Ha! I helped to bring that about. I, the poor, despised, insignificant temple slave. Like all proud, superstitious fools, they were ready enough to believe the tales I carried from one to another. Sven Bjornsson rather fancied himself in those days. High adviser to the Council of Guilds, he scorned me. Once he called me an abject, cowardly slave to my face, but it was the slave who undermined Sven Bjornson's work, and the slave who caused Tlapallan's fall. And those hulking guardians, neutral by oath. God, but they were bitter against each other before I had finished. A desirable citizen they got when they got you. But Kennedy, caught in the rush of his own triumphal memories, went on. Of course, luck was with me, or I'd have brought nothing out of the grand smash but myself and some pleasant memories. Markozuma, he was an under-priest of Nakakiatl, is one, yet, in fact, what, Marco? I call him that, yes. The other's too long for convenience, and too odd. We haven't been anxious to make people ask questions of any sort. Even you can understand that. But Markozuma he is, and still a priest of Nakakiatl, in his own silly opinion. Cullen had cause to doubt it, but if Kennedy had not discovered the albino's demise, there seemed no good reason to enlighten him. As I was saying, Markozuma had already got in pretty deep with me. Then he was kind enough to have a revelation of his own, or say he had one, in which his black ugliness there expressed a desire to escape into a wider field of activity, and named me as his chosen agent. And maybe the creator of hatreds wasn't off in his choice of an agent at that, Mr. Kennedy. Will you shut up, or do you prefer to be gagged? You're wise for once. Be silent and listen. While they were fighting on the lake, Marco and a few of his fellows, who believed in his silly revelation, helped move his godship and this temple paraphernalia that you see out of the hills and afterward lugged them to civilization for me. And then they were fools enough to go back to that cataclysmic hell we'd left raging behind us, all but Marco. He is a coward as well as a fool, and besides, there was the girl. What? The girl. Why do you look— Ah, you did see her that night, didn't you, and lied about it afterward? Do you mean to tell me that that Marco— Oh, forget the girl. She's not important. I brought her along for the same reason that I brought his black ugliness yonder. Markozuma has been in love with her since she was a mere child, but the poor fellow is no beauty himself, and her father would never hear of a match between them. She has always sworn she'd kill herself if I gave her to Marco, but that doesn't seem to faze his devotion a particle. Queer. I wouldn't step out of my road for all the dark-eyed beauties that ever walked, but Marco is a cowardly, weak simpleton of a man. I've never let him have her for just that reason, afraid she would kill herself and Marco would follow suit, and until recently I've needed the fool. He believes that Nakakiatl has deigned in a measure to carnify himself in me. Between desire for the girl and fear of the black god he fancies is in me, I have owned the man body and soul, and in no other way could I have owned him so completely. To tell you the truth, I rather suspect that the young lady has overcome her distaste for his society and persuaded him to take her away from here. I was out last night, tell you about that later, and when I came back they had both disappeared. But it's no particular matter. They are such a queer pair that no one would believe any story they could tell, and Marco, at least, has enough sense to know better than tell tales on me. Let 'em go. I don't need either of them, any more than I need the statue there. I'd have that carted out and broken up tomorrow, only, to tell you the truth, I've a certain affection for the silly thing. Rather a pretty little parlor ornament, isn't it? He chuckled. Well, to return to my story, luck was with me from the start. I tell you, though superstition was Bonaparte's one weakness, I can almost sympathize with the little Corsican's belief in his star of destiny. If there had been a real star of destiny working for me, things could have been made no easier. You would think that shipping all that gold out of Mexico, particularly in the form it bears, would have been a hard enough trick to put over. The government would have grabbed the whole loot at the first suspicion of what I was taking out. It isn't worth my while to tell you the full history of that trip, but it fairly ran on greased rails from start to finish. We ended with a run across the Gulf to New Orleans in a schooner that must have been plastered with pure luck. I don't know of anything else that could have held her rotten old timbers together. Her skipper knew me in other days, helped me out for the sake of old times, and one of the gold ingots Marco had looted from the temple supply of raw material. I rather expected a knife in the back, but Diego Rosales must have become quite a reformed character in the years I spent in Tlapallan. He told me he had never seen so easy a run as we made, nor one he was so glad to see the end of. Complained of frightful dreams through the entire voyage, and stuck on deck without sleeping all the last 48 hours. I asked him why, and all I could get out of him was, tengo miedo malo. But what he was badly afraid of, unless it was the dyspepsia that gave him the dreams, is a mystery to me yet. If anyone had reason to be afraid, it was I. That old rip of a schooner, with her leaky hold full of my gold, and the original 16 pirates of the 16 men on the dead man's chest song for a crew. Queerer yet, if you knew Rosales, he deliberately took the ingot I'd given him and dropped it over the side, just after we came to anchor. Those pirates looked on, wooden-faced, and it was their gold as well as his, mind you. I came back on board that night after the stuff was landed, and I'll be darned if they hadn't dug out a relico of Santa Maria from somewhere about the ship and set it up near the bow, and the whole gang of 'em on their knees to it. To purify the ship of its passenger, Rosales said. I might have felt personally insulted if there hadn't been 3 of us, and one such a queer-looking beggar as Marco. Maybe those red eyes of his got their goat. 4 of you, corrected Cullen O'Hara softly. No, 3. The girl and Marco and I. But I didn't bother much to find out what particular superstition was troubling Rosales. The old contrabandista had landed my stuff so that the customs authorities never got a look in, and that was enough for me. Done up in straw and gunny sacking it was. Never even had wooden cases till I had it in a warehouse, and from there I took it to another as mineral specimens. And by George, I shipped it north as freight. Plain, common as dirt freight, and never lost a piece. Chances? Of course I took chances. But the difference between a fool and a wise man lies in the kind of chances he takes, and I rather fancy that success is the last criterion of that. Even if Rosales had suffered a change heart and told tales of me on the other side of the Gulf, there was little connection between Archer Kennedy, one time of Campeche, and Mr. Chester T. Reed, who signed bills of lading at last for several cases of worthless bits of stone. Kennedy paused. After a moment he kicked reflectively at one of the golden urns. "Lord," he said, "there was a time when just owning so much yellow glory would have turned my head, and look how I use it now. To me it is merely a non-corroding elemental metal, necessary to a certain process, and which it amuses me to utilize in the traditional forms it was carved into in Tlapallan. But if I should ever need money, you would find how sacred the temple vessels are to me. Not that I expect that need to come. By the time I've run through what raw gold we brought away, I'll have a stronger ruling power than gold in my hands." "Supernaturalism is only dangerous," continued Kennedy, "if you believe in it. The priest made that mistake. I didn't. With the one little mystery that I managed to bring out of Tlapallan, I shall establish such a dominion as the world never saw before. Men bow to 2 powers, gold and fear. In the day when I am ready, they will bow to one only, and that will be in my control. Gold. What's gold beside fear?" Again he kicked contemptuously at the urn. Then he stopped speaking abruptly, and a queer, dazed look came into his face. He passed a hand over his forehead. "Strange, too," he muttered, more to himself than Cullen. "I could do a lot with all this wealth here. Mastery of the world. What will I get out of it more than the gold will buy me?" "A very sensible question," approved Cullen. "But what have the bogies yonder, that you're so set on claiming as your own, to do with world mastery?" Why, they are only a beginning." The tone was almost querulous. He was like a man half asleep and beginning to doubt his dream. But in continuing, the dazed look passed, and his old grandiloquent manner returned. Only a beginning. I had to learn the method. Marco taught me much, but the priests had never half realized what could be done. They were afraid of their own power, the fools. My fearless intelligence has wonderfully improved results. The brutes grow now with the most amazing rapidity, and multiply. And how they eat! You would hardly believe that those starved-looking beasts get away with living meat enough to keep a whole jungle full of tigers fat and happy. It's growing so fast, I suppose. But in the first month, after getting all this in order, I achieved only 2 successes. The beauty that strayed to Carpentier in June, and Genghis Khan, who, by the way, remained strong enough for all your attempt to injure him. He dragged your weight from the gates down here with one arm. As for the other, my firstborn, as you might say, your sister killed it before it was half grown. It strayed away one night, and I fancy you can guess the answer now to your famous bungalow mystery. The poor brute crawled home up the creek and died before morning. Lord, but I was angry. Then, in a few short weeks, came all these. He gestured with that left hand of his in its bulky white glove. "Came from where?" asked Cullen. "I heard tell of a man once who went down into hell and bargained with the old boy himself for a billy-goat, but I never did give what you might call credence to the story. If you've been doing the like of that, though, Mr. Kennedy, I'd advise—" "Oh, silence! Do you hear me? Silence! Your superstitious chatter is enough to drive a man mad. I tell you, these beasts are of my own making, mine. Or rather, they are my creations, from the common, silly, useless forms they first grew in. How can I make a dolt like you understand?" "I don't know, unless you should tell it all in plain English." "It is rather difficult," sneered the Lord of Fear, "for me to make clear to a man like you the technical details of a process more than sufficiently recondite for the comprehension of a—" "I understand all those words," said Cullen meekly. "Of a trained thinker," finished the other. "Will you kindly cease interrupting me? As I was saying, to make the details clear to you is not only impossible, but needless. I should not go into the matter in any degree, were it not that I wish to dismiss from your so-called intelligence the idea that you are about to become the victim of a supernatural phenomenon. Do you know what occurs when an organic substance undergoes what is known as decay?" "It rots," came the rather weary reply. The answer I would have expected. But to delve a little deeper into the veridical nature of this rotting— "The cell structure," broke in his audience, "deteriorates under the caducous influence of the oxygenation of the atmosphere and other similar atrocities. Mr. Kennedy, as you say, I'm a man of the simplest attainments. And not only that, but between being hit on the neck and loss of blood, and the elegant ventilation of this strike-off between a voodoo temple and a section of purgatory, 'tis only by sheer will-power that I do not faint from moment to moment. If you've information to impart, put it in words of one syllable, and as few of them as possible, or I'll not take the trouble to stay in my senses to hear it." There may have been that in his face which confirmed the statement and urged haste. At any rate, the would-be lecturer conceded glumly, "I can't explain it so that most of it won't go over your head, but the ABC of it is this. In an animate creature, the life of the microscopic individual cells which form its tissues, and the life of the organization of all those cells, in other words, of the creature in toto, are entirely separate and distinct. An animal may die, in the common sense of the word, and if its body is kept in a place sterile of germs and of moderately cool temperature, the cell life will not perish for a considerable period. In fact, the body of that dead animal is so very much alive that a portion of it may be grafted upon the body of another living animal, and that portion will take up its normal functions as if there had been no interim of death. In other words, flesh, tissue, blood, sinew, and the organic matter of bone never die until decay sets in. But, paradoxically in sound, not fact, decay is always preceded by death, not the death of the animal, but the death of the cell. And decay means dissolution, the breaking down of the cell structure, the resolving of firm flesh into a semi-liquid and putrescent mass. That is the natural course. There is, however, a certain substance of obscure mineral derivatives which was known to Nakak-Yaatl's priests, and whose secret I brought away with me, as well as a considerable supply of the substance itself. The application of a thin film of this substance in solution to living tissue dissolves the cell organization, which it immediately permeates, without destroying either the cell structure, the life of the cell, or the life of the organization. One might call this portion of the process pseudo-putrescence, false decay. As it goes on, the entire being of an organization melts, as it were, into a homogeneous, jelly-like mass, and yet remains in every sense alive. Kennedy paused impressively. Cullen saw that for once comment was really desired. "'Twould be more exciting," he ventured, "did you give a name to your organism. So be it was a cabbage now, or a turnip, one's sympathies would scarce go out to the poor thing, as they might to—" "Stop it!" shouted Kennedy. "Is there no power on earth which will divert your idiotic flippancy into serious attention? I clearly indicated that I was speaking of animal life, not vegetable. Can't you understand that it is the blood, the sinews, the bones, the living, conscious, feeling flesh that is resolved into this—" "That's enough," flashed Cullen. "You make me sick, you do. The man that would do the thing like that to so much as a rat is not fit to be living in the world at all, and much less listened to." "So, that is how you feel about it, eh?" "That's how I feel about it." Kennedy seemed rather pleased than angered. This was the first symptom of any emotion other than indifferent contempt which he had managed to elicit from his captive. "Then you don't wish to hear," he continued, "how in this vital jelly there rises a new impulse, a reorganization of the cells, a reconstruction to a new form, moulded, strangely enough, by neither chance nor heredity, but solely by the will of the—" "Of the empty head who is at work? No, I care to hear no more at all about it." "Empty head!" ejaculated Kennedy indignantly. "I said it. Any man who is fool enough to play with the devil's own process you've been describing, to try to explain it by a rigmarole of science, not to perceive the black power behind his own power, such a man is no more nor less than an empty head, and I say it again. What do I care for your methods? Look at your results. Look your results in the eye, Mr. Kennedy, and then tell it to me that the worser beast on the dais there had no finger in their making." "Fool! Fool! Fool!" The Lord of Fear fairly raged up and down the floor. "I'll show you. You shall see with your own eyes. Before you pass beyond comprehension, you shall see the living creature. Rabbit, cat, bird, it makes no difference what creature, or how silly and innocuous. You shall see it lie in the elemental vessel of gold. You shall see me anointed with my own hand, see me lave it then in the second solution, and—" his voice calmed, lowered, and grew almost reverent. "You shall see that the creature dissolved to a quivering, living mass, almost transparent, palpitant with strange, fugacious hues, with one steady crimson fleck at the center that is the nucleus. And from that nucleus you shall watch how the new structure spreads and forms. To you it may be dreadful because it is so strange. To the trained mind it is a beautiful and a very curious sight. It is like watching a wonderful egg, of which the shell is transparent, and seeing the live creature within grow visibly. It is more than that. It is like being God, a real God, and beholding the formless protoplasm take structural shape under mere power of will. Oh, there is a science of will as well as of matter. One has to get the trick of it, and it doesn't come too easily, I assure you. There is a point in the process where one's bare hands must be laid very cautiously on the work. If you miss that point of time, it all melts away to an evil-smelling mess that has to be burned. The very odor is poisonous. If you act too soon, there is a greater danger. I had one accident that taught me, but never mind that now." Then, at that moment of crisis, The whole force of one's being must be concentrated in a thought, and one can almost feel it flow through one's fingertips. Then watch. First come the little scarlet veins, an orderly tangle of filaments, shooting out from that red speck at the jelly's heart. They grow and the arteries form. The bones begin to be fragile, translucent as clouded glass. Presently a dim throbbing comes. All the center is clouded now, and under the shapeless, glistening surface a shape is beginning to show. The shape I had thought of. Two dim, flame-colored discs peer out at me, and I know that they are eyes, the feral yet obedient eyes of my newly created one. The outer jelly is almost absorbed now. It solidifies, toughens into membrane, into skin. But why should I tell you more? You shall see. And after that, doubt if you can that I am a creator in my own unguided right. But never think me a conceited egotist. No. I don't pretend to know all that goes on in my laboratory, what true scientific man does. There are even yet phases, difficult riddles. For instance, the amazingly rapid aftergrowth. I have the wet marsh there for them, because in that environment they grow faster, larger, stronger. I take the little new beast, all naked and shivering and snarling with feeble resentment. I take it and feed it well. It eats from the first moment, and lay it in that cool mire among the white rushes and the fungi whose spawn I brought from Tlapallan. It creeps away and is gone, and when, an hour or so later, I call my beast to the edge and bid them seize their living food, the little new beast comes with them, and already it is larger. But that is by no means all. These beasts have a faculty that they share with no other creatures save the simplest organisms. They do not multiply slowly, but split in twos as easily as— Master Kennedy, can you not realize that 'tis a nightmare you're talking, not science? I tell you they do. They must. I admitted that I hadn't traced that phase of the experiment yet, but in no other way can their extraordinarily rapid multiplication be accounted for. And the queerest part is, they don't split into twos of the same kind. The gatekeeper now, the shining leechworm. I never made him. He was draped round the neck of that statue when I came down one morning. I knew at once that he had crawled up there from the swamp, looking for food. But I'll admit that the thing gave even me rather a start. It was so different from anything I had even thought of making. But obedience is the test. When I found he obeyed even better and more intelligently than the rest, I knew him for the child of my children. I named him Gatekeeper and hid him in the lodge. The last owner hanged himself there, and there are some remarkably silly stories current about it. I generally leave the gates unlocked at night now. Anyone who comes prying through them will find a gatekeeper to tell a real story about, if he survives. Isn't that an amusing idea? The first night you came here, I rather expected him to get you as you went out, but I suppose, having seen you admitted, he regarded you as under protection. Very like, agreed Cullen dryly. It was characteristic of both men that neither had made reference to any reason why Kennedy, whatever horrors he kept for the rest of the world, should have refrained from loosing them on Cullen. The debt of life one man owed the other had been easily cancelled on Kennedy's side for the sake of a fancied grievance. For Cullen, what was done with. If he had nearly sacrificed his own life, not once, but twice, to preserve a creature so contemptible, why, so much the worse for him. "I suppose," he continued, "that it was this gatekeeper pet of yours that wandered into my veranda a few weeks ago, and ran again, poor cowardly worm, for the silly noise of some pots and pans." The Lord of Fear started and frowned. "No," he said shortly. "I never sent him to the bungalow." "Then it must have strayed like the others. Wasn't it an odd coincidence now that Genghis Khan, who never got inside the house, was the only one of the lot that didn't manage to do a bit of damage to a certain little statue I owned? Quetzalcoatl it was, the same that yourself introduced me to when we were together at Bjornson's hacienda." Watching closely, Cullen thought that a reminiscence of that odd, dazed appearance shadowed the other's face. Then the man shook it off and scowled. "I know nothing of it. If it happened, it was a coincidence, and I can see nothing particularly strange about it. Till last night, I never sent or guided any of my beasts outside these grounds. I tell you, I am not yet ready. If you hadn't come prying, I would probably have never bothered with you at all. Do you think that I am a man to go out of my way for the sake of anything so trivial as you, unless driven to it? As for the image, I read in one reporter's account that you had brought it from Mexico. Did you really find time and courage to go back at last? I waited for you long enough, hoping against hope that you'd cross the desert alive somehow and return with help." "There," said Cullen gravely. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Kennedy. If I'd guessed you were still living, I'd have gone earlier, but it's done with now. Along with a number of other things, including Tlapallan and yourself." He grinned. "You'll see the point of that shortly. To return to my gatekeeper, I don't believe he ever went near the bungalow. I told you he was more intelligent and obedient than the rest. But for that matter, save for one or two unimportant lapses, they are all obedient. As they grow larger, I may find a use for the fenced enclosures I supposed would be necessary. But now, well, you can see for yourself. Look into their eyes. Can you see a hunger there? And yet not one of them will cross the deadline after that first beast's rebuff. And the gatekeeper, think of it, loose in the lodge and attending his duty more closely than any human. There's a science of will, I tell you, as well as of matter. Those I made, my will went into, and their procreations recognize me as master. Think of a horde of such, when I am ready, ravaging the countryside by night, slaying whom I will to slay, and always multiplying, increasing, growing in numbers faster than men can kill them off. And they won't be easily killed. They die hard at best, and besides, man is lord of the beasts only because he is more intelligent. These will have the intellect of man himself behind them. Had I directed that poor brute in June, there would have been no trail of its blood to set folks gaping. Have you seen the bungalow today? It is rather fortunate that you weren't in it last night, for after considerable thought, I have decided to use you in a much better way than by killing you. I had seen a danger in that eternal curiosity of yours, and thought it best to get rid of you quickly, and in your own house rather than here. But having you alive in my very hands, there is another temptation which I find quite irresistible. But if you had been in the bungalow, wasn't the wreckage there pretty thorough? My newer servants are very strong and easily directed. Do you wonder that I call myself the Lord of Fear, and say that I will some day rule the world?" "You'll rule the inside of a condemned cell," said Cullen coldly. "You've done nothing that I can perceive but make a warlock of yourself, and at that no self-respecting man would be afraid of you. You're not the first to trade your soul to the old boy for promise of the world and all, but of them that ever did it, you do look the most foolish. Take my advice, little man. Smash the black one there before it's too late. Clean out your swamp with a shotgun and start fresh. Free my arms, and I'll find strength to help you to the doing of it. Is it a bargain?" The self-styled Lord of Fear glared pure exasperation. "You will help me," he snarled, "but not in that way. Do you see my hand?" He thrust it under Cullen's nose. "I see an uncommonly ugly glove, from one of your pet's paws by the talons of it." "Glove?" The man pushed up his cuff to disclose the wrist. "Look closer, fool. An accident did that to me. A moment's carelessness when I was attempting my first recreation. Do you remember those white hounds you fought in the pass? I'll never forget the minute when I first discovered their origin. You'll help me, I say, and that great lumbering body of yours will be put to good use at last. I'll dissolve your living flesh and remold it to such a shape as will frighten even your brothers of the swamp. And after that you'll kill and destroy at my bidding. Yes, though I sent you against a friend, or those of your own flesh and blood, you'll hate and rend and kill and die, ravening at last in some midnight battle fought for my sake and glory. "No," said Cullen. Had that beast hand closed on his heart, he could have hardly been more sickeningly shocked. Somehow, the final inference of all Kennedy's wild talk and vague threats had not come home to him until this moment. They had been talking of the transmutation of beasts into other beasts, of the lower order of creatures, for which even the kindest-hearted of men feels a sympathy rather patronizing. Cullen had thought to be killed, fed to the monsters of the swamp, perhaps, a fate bad enough. But this... And yet Cullen's voice, though still hoarse, sounded very sane and cool. "No, you can't do that with me, Mr. Kennedy." "Why not, pray?" "One of the rabbits that went to making those stalking terrors yonder could be no more in my power than you are." "No," said Cullen again. "A rabbit, maybe. Yourself, I don't doubt. 'Twould take little at best to bring the beast out of you, Mr. Kennedy. But a real man, no." "You flatter yourself. Again, why not?" "It won't be allowed, that's all. If you were really the clever devil you think you are, you'd know that. Ask Nakaki-Otto there. By the eye of him, he's had a wider experience than yourself, and he knows why not." Before Kennedy could reply, there came a slow, shuffling sound from somewhere outside the cellar. It stopped, and that one door in the wall was pushed open. Something, it was hard to see what, bulked palely in the dark beyond. Then it came on slowly, shufflingly. It came into the light and across the floor, and it laid the burden it had half-dragged, half-earned hither in the space between Kennedy and his prisoner. Of all the horrors that Cullen had met since entering the gates at dusk, only one had really shaken him to the soul. Not the real gatekeeper coiled around his chest had been so bad as that first moment when he thought the drooped oval of its head was Marco's face. And just so, not the sight of goblins, nor the black, brooding genius of goblins, nor even the beast paw that Kennedy bore for a hand, not one of these things had moved him as did the sight of Marco's body, dragged in and laid gravely at his feet by Genghis Khan. If Khan were not a real ape, he had all the appearance of one. He had the short, bowed legs of a simian, the thin arms, the tremendous chest and almost neckless head. But above all, he had the infinite simian sadness in his face. No human accuser could have equaled the solemnity of Khan's manner in that act, which he performed as one who does the last sad duty by a departed friend. Then, with startling abruptness, he turned a back somersault, landed on Nakaki-Otto's sacred dais, and crouched there, chattering and nursing the broken arm he had probably forgotten when he attempted that acrobatic feat. The grotesquerie of it was the final straw for Cullen. Marco had lain heavy enough on his conscience. Having learned the full history, and become cognizant of the monstrous crimes toward which Kennedy's work, made possible by Marco, was directed, Cullen might reasonably have felt the burden lighter. But so far this view had not struck him. For 24 hours he had agonized in spirit over the killing of this weakling, and those hours had left their mark. To be presented with his victim's corpse by a white monkey thing that turned somersaults afterward was the strain too much. What strength had been left him fell away like a dropping tide. Dimly he heard a voice say, "Marco, and dead. Well, by George, I thought he and the girl had run off together. I wonder what's become of her then." But Kennedy's further speculations went unheard, for his prisoner had fainted. End of Chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Citadel of Fear by Gertrude Barrows Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Citadel of Fear, Chapter 26, To Undine. Far toward the heart of the city, a car sped silently over the asphalt, with a greatly perturbed young man at the wheel. The car was Cleona's, and this late expedition was Cleona's, and Cleona herself was in it. By the time she and Sven Bjornsson had finished, comparing notes and jumping at the maddest conclusions Rhodes had ever heard spoken in sober earnest, that young man was in a semi-dazed condition. He scarcely retained spirit to protest when Cleona commanded him to run out her car, to place in it his shotgun and what other firearms were in the house, and prepare instantly for a sortie in force against the house of a man he had never heard of 24 hours earlier. His suggestion of police was met with a scorn to take his breath away. But here, having learned that a man high in the city detective force was already working on the case, Bjornsson seconded Rhodes' demand that the law be called into alliance. "No need to explain fully," he asserted. "Keep the story within their comprehension. The bungalow affair is a lever to move them which I should have lacked, working alone. Begin by telephoning this McClellan that O'Hara had reason to suspect the owner of the Undine place of keeping dangerous wild beasts in an insecure manner, and went there this afternoon or evening alone. Tell him that O'Hara was not returned here, though he agreed to do so, and that a man, myself of course, has brought you information about Kennedy, alias Reed, which proves him a very dangerous criminal. Tell him that you and I will run downtown and join him, that I will then make known to him facts that justify Kennedy's instant arrest, and that for good reasons he had best have a detail of several men ready to go out there with us. I believe the charge that Kennedy kidnapped my daughter is serious enough. We shan't need to venture on the more, improbable part. What we shall certainly find in his house will speak for itself, I think. There might be delay in swearing out a warrant on the kidnapping charge, so in phoning, be sure and emphasize the fact we believe O'Hara's life to be in serious peril." Somewhat reluctantly, Rhodes undertook the task set for him. His disbelief in Bjornsson's story as a whole was not voluntary. He couldn't believe it. But on the other hand, that story, in combination with Cullen's strange experience with the giant ape, had brought him to a kind of incredulous uneasiness of mind about it all, and to have the place investigated by lawful authorities would cut the knot of doubt in a very satisfactory manner. He called the detective bureau at City Hall, and by luck caught McClellan just as the latter was about to lay off and go home early. The life of a city detective being both strenuous and irregular, he accomplished this feat about 1 day in 30, and, being human as well as stolid, he sometimes got very tired. He was tired tonight. Rhodes, of course, could not know this. Neither could he know that, in the light of their last parting, sympathetic concern for Cullen O'Hara's life or limb had no share in McClellan's feeling for him. But Rhodes did know that the ensuing conversation was so highly unsatisfactory that he suddenly hung up the receiver very forcibly and turned a flushed, indignant face to the other two. "He says that Cullen told him to drop the bungalow case, and when he reported, his chief took him off the assignment. He says that if you will come down and make your complaint in person, Mr. Bjornsson, the matter of Reed will be investigated, but they cannot make a night raid on a respectable householder unless the person demanding it presents convincing proof and good credentials of his own. He seems to ignore the fact that I myself am a respectable householder. He said—" "He was extremely insolent," snapped the young lawyer, breaking off into sheer indignation. "He deserves to be reported to his chief. I think I'll do that little thing, too." He reached again for the receiver, but Cleona caught his hand and fairly dragged him away from the telephone. "Tony, my Cullen has gone to Undine, and you waste time arguing with the police? I know he's gone there. Didn't Mr. Bjornsson see him in Carpentier and see him put the car to the Undine road at a speed to frighten one? I've known it all evening. He's gone there in search of her, and from what he said, 'tis sure as the world that she's travelled the same way in search of him. And it's there we'll find both of them, so be they've not been murdered before this." And so, almost before he knew it, Rhodes found himself, his wife, and a stranger in the car, bound, apparently, on the armed invasion of another utter stranger's residence. "Hurry!" came her voice in his ear. "We're making enough speed to cost me a fortune in fines, if every policeman we've passed has taken our number. What's that in life or death? Mr. Bjornsson, have you a plan for us when we reach there?" "No," he said simply. "If what I know might be is true, then our going alone in this manner is mere suicide. And yet, that detective's attitude was rather indicative. We've no hours to waste. How could we convince the police in time, or where else could we raise a force of men tonight?" End of Chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Citadel of Fear by Gertrude Barrows Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Citadel of Fear, Chapter 27. Strange Victim, Stranger Conqueror. Though invisible from the road, in the gate lodge its keeper still pulsed with a faint, excited glowing. The flat length lay in a loose coil, the head with its speck-like eyes at rest on the threshold of the lodge. Suddenly the head lifted. With a swaying motion it rose upward some 5 feet, to droop and poise, a luminous oval, as when Cullen had first seen it to his sorrow. By some sense, whether of hearing or vibration, it had become aware that the gate was softly opening, that someone had entered and was advancing along the drive. Into the keeper's range of vision, if it had vision and were not guided by some other unknown sense, there flitted a dark figure. The obscuring mists of earlier evening had been blown away by the gusty night wind. Had the figure turned, it would have seen clearer than had Cullen that floating, menacing oval in the lodge. But it did not turn, and when the keeper shot out in pursuit, the rustle of straightening coils was lost in the swish and clash of wind-torn, bare branches. Unwarned, the dark figure hurried on up the drive, and like a writhing white flame the keeper followed. In a moment it was almost upon the heels of its second quarry. There came one of those freakish gusts, like the breath of an invisible giant. It crashed through the branches and swept the black cloak out like a sail. Something came whistling down through the air with the speed of a flung spear. The keeper's intended quarry hurried on, but the keeper itself no longer followed. Writhing, lashing, a fury of pulsing fire, it whipped its length again and again about the enemy that had pinned it to the path. But the enemy was only an old dry branch, broken off by the wind and hurled endwise. Let the impaled creature fight as it would, a dry branch is to be neither terrorized nor slain. In a frantic tangle of flashing coils and snapping, splintering twigs, the gatekeeper remained wholly engaged with its conqueror. End of Chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Citadel of Fear by Gertrude Barrows Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Citadel of Fear, Chapter 28. Rival Claimants. Cullen O'Hara had a vision. He thought that again he lay stretched on the workroom floor. Though his eyes were closed, he thought that the lids grew transparent, and by this phenomenon a great clarity of sight came upon him, so that all about him was thrice clear, and without stirring a muscle he could see every part of his surroundings. He and Marco lay side by side, very stiff and straight. This seemed just, though unpleasant. When Kennedy came with Genghis Khan to roll and drag him away, had he been able to speak he would have protested. They had no sense of what was fitting. Or perhaps they were ignorant of who had slain the poor weakling. With his one good arm, Khan was trying to lift him now. They had dragged him to the golden font, and he noted, with no particular interest, that the stained apron no longer draped the third cougar's head. Then he perceived that Kennedy was wearing it, and was also trying to fit a glove, yellow and shining a soft, flexible gold, over his right hand, but the taloned white paw that had been his left retained no skill. At last he motioned the great ape to aid him, and Khan did. The ape's hand was clever enough, for all the fur on the back of it. Did that prove the created beast its creator's superior? Cullen pondered this deeply, but ere he could reach a satisfactory conclusion they were at him again. Kennedy began untying the knots of his bonds, but left off suddenly. "No," muttered he. "To be on the safe side, I shall have to anesthetize before stripping him. The faint may be only a sham. Let him stay tied for a while." This amused Cullen, who knew himself to be dead. How cautious the little man was! Now Khan was lifting at him once more. This time the master helped, and though his strength was comparatively feeble, the two of them managed to raise Cullen to the font's level. Tumbled over the edge, he subsided into the font and lay there uncomfortably. The thing wasn't long enough. His neck was doubled at a painful angle. Marco's body now would have fitted much better. If they must have a corpse to the font, why couldn't they have chosen Marco's? Then, for though his face was below the basin's edge, he could see as well as ever what went on. He perceived that Kennedy was taking some jars, some boxes, and a small flask from the depths of those golden vessels by the wall. He came presently and set them out on a kind of shelf that extended from the font. The flask he took in his hand, and it was a thing of gold and great value, and carved all over with writhing, lizard-like forms. The stopper of it, which was glass or crystal, fitted tightly, and Kennedy had some trouble in removing it, but it came out at last. He sniffed, as if testing the freshness of the stuff it contained, smiled in unpleasant satisfaction, replaced the stopper, and set it down again. Then he stooped, and from the floor behind the font lifted a more commonplace receptacle, a large glass bottle, half filled with some kind of colorless fluid. After that, there were 2 or 3 things done, but exactly what they were Cullen was not sure, because the strange sight that had come on him blurred for a time and was all confused, shadowy, and not to be remembered. Something was put over his face, he thought, and after a time taken away again. A sickish sweet odor oppressed him, hands fumbled about his body, and somewhere, very far away, a bell rang constantly. Then, clearer if possible than before, the sight returned. There was Kennedy still, but he had done with the bottle, and now he was for opening one of the small olden jars. As he did it, he looked at Cullen, and behind his beard the thin red lips grew to a smile that was ugly as a toad's without its honesty. Suddenly, with no moment's interim of thought or doubt, Cullen knew the meaning and the end of these preparations. And he knew that he was not dead, but only helpless, and that the slit-like, watchful eyes behind those round glasses were no longer Kennedy's, but the eyes of Nakaki-Atl, maker of goblins. With that, he who had been Archer Kennedy faded to nothing, and in his place stood the naked evil that had squatted on the dais. Smiling, it leaned to pass treacherous, caressing fingers across the victim's face. Cullen's spirit shivered, but all that was great in him rose to fierce rebellion. Never, never! What claim had that dark vileness upon him? But he could not even speak to protest, for his body slept. Then somewhere a low, clear voice was sounding. "Wait," it said softly. "Nakaki-Atl, you who were once my brother, wait, lest you break the law that must not be broken and destroy yourself with the world." Cullen had thought the voice that of his dusk lady, but surely the demon had never been a brother of hers. His attention, which had been fixed on what hung over him, widened. The speaker, he discovered, was a tall youth, very slender, who stood before the font facing Nakaki-Atl across Cullen's body. In one hand he grasped a staff, its serpent head curving out of a circlet of quail feathers. Of the speckled quail feathers was his cloak, and the round shield he bore on his left arm was rimmed with them. His face was very bright and beautiful, a kindly face too, with patient, smiling lips. But in the eyes a spirit lurked that made less incongruous the gaping, intolerant jaws of the serpent crest above it. And every plume about him flickered, wavering, as if in some draught that blew on him alone, for the air in the place was still. Looking beyond him, Cullen perceived that the floored space beneath the shaft had filled with thronging people. Very strange folk they were, and at the same time extraordinarily familiar. Like old friends in masqueraders' robes, he knew each one, and recalled the names of them in different lands. There was him whose flowing robes were woven of the beaded gray rain. White foam was his beard, and his eyes were like blue ice caverns. Tlaloc was he, Neptune, and Manannan, son of that great one who dwells forever invisible in the sleeve Fuad. But his robes were not all gray. At one side they were struck through to rainbow hues by another who stood behind him. That was Luch, the shining one, Tonathiu, the fiery one, Amen-Ra of the Egyptians, Apollo of the Greeks. Mestli, with his paler fire, was there, Sentiotl, who is Ceres and also Dana, mother of gods, Tlapallan with their flasks of healing, and Tezat-Zoncatl, merry of face and wreathed like Bacchus. They and many others of friendly appearance stood behind their spokesman, but a demon leered across Cullen's body, and the mouth of him was wide and cruel. "Shall I wait?" said Nakhakeotl. "Yes, for the man is mine. But yesterday he was claimed for me in Tlapallan." "But yesterday he was claimed for me also, and— but yesterday Tlapallan fell. Did you save your servants?" "Tlapallan's time was ended, and I might not save them. But death is little. I have fought for you for this man's life because I love him, but slay him now if you will, for my children do not fear death. Slay him and spare this other deed which is forbidden." "Did you forbid it when my white hounds roamed the hills?" "Your hounds served a sacred use, to guard Tlapallan. Moreover, in their making, only your power, not your spirit, went into them. Their violence was the clean violence that fights, but not for malice. For the sake of their origin, those hounds stood equal with the mighty guardians. But the hounds you send forth today are fouler than foul. Evil is their service, and their nature an infinite degradation." "They are as I wish them." "Then degrade beasts only, or such beasts as are human only in form. Claim service of your own, Black One, but this is my child. I have followed him through many lands, and I know him well. His spirit has flamed to the courage of my breath. I have sung to him on the plains, and lulled him to sleep in the forests. He is one of my clean-hearted children, and you may not corrupt him." "He has traversed my waters," muttered a new voice, deep and thunderous as distant breakers. "In our play we hurled great billows, the Lord of the air and I. We hurled them against him, and he was not afraid." "I have set my burning mark upon him," Tonathiu spoke, a hissing whisper. "I have tested him well, and the fire of my own spirit was not more steadfast than his." "Beware of us, O mine enemy." The feathered one's countenance grew bright and fierce, even as the glory of Tonathiu. Wildly waved his turbulent plumes, and raising his serpent staff, he shook it like a spear. "Beware of us, for our patience is nearly ended. Tlapallan fell, but its time was finished. Think not that we will stand idle forever while you destroy our children. The Lord of the Air guards his own." "There is a house on a hill," sneered the demon, "that you did not guard." "You know otherwise. Not against me did you send your emissaries, but against this man, who had been claimed for me, and against his loved one, knowing that your own claim on him was false." "Not so false now as then," murmured Nakhakeotl. "I say," continued the other sternly, "knowing that you might not corrupt him, you sought the lesser satisfaction of killing. Not against me were your emissaries sent, but was it not my staff, my little broken staff, that sent back the first crawling up a blood-stained stream? Was it not my shield, my little broken shield, that kept the second, the glimmering worm, at bay till my child should awaken? For the third, no ward of mine was needed. But the fourth, was it not my great voice roaring in the trees that called my child away from a force too strong for him?" "There is no question," retorted Nakhakeotl, and there was a sneer in his tone that was very like Kennedy's. "There could be no question that before you were Lord of the Air, you were a man. So do men boast of their most trifling deeds. The end of it all is, your child, or this that was your child, lies here. What protection do you offer him now, most powerful one?" There came a pause and a silence. The other gods stirred restlessly, as in anger, but Quetzalcoatl's face grew patient again, and when he spoke, it was in a voice of pleading, gentle as the wind of spring. "He is not yours. O Nakakio'tl, once you were called Telpukli, the young, and Tezcatlipoca, shining mirror. You rewarded the just, and for the wrongdoer you had mercy to bestow. Remember your youth, Telpukli, and be merciful." But the evil god only grinned wider. "Men made me what I am, and for that I hate them. And in all Anahuac there was no mercy among them. In the shrieks of the bloody sacrifice, in the cries of babes murdered upon my altars, in the steam that arose from the unspeakable feast, the mirror of Tezcatlipoca was fouled and dimmed, till Pukli grew black, old, and cruel. I am Nekak-Yaotl, creator of hatreds, and why should I alone of the gods walk unrecognized? To Tlaloc are the rains, floods, clouds, and the billows. All these are his visible servants. Tonatiuh is seen of all, and you, Lord of the Air, you are heard in the forests. In the day of your anger men know you and bow down in fear. But I, who am stronger than any, must work in secret. My own bond-servants deny me. Many centuries I sat patient in Tlapallan, working in secret, restricted by the very priests that served me, till there came to our hills a man who was mine from birth. Even he, being man, I must delude, lest in full knowledge of its service the weak vessel be shattered. The Fortress of Fear he has named this, but it has a truer and more secret name, the birthplace of corruption. Yet he has been an apt tool. Look about you in this, the seat he prepared for me unknowing. Free runs my will today, and freer shall it run tomorrow. Hate breeds hate, and demon produces demon. How fast have their numbers increased! He is pleased like a child, and believes that he shall rule the world. He, that empty, hollow reed through which my will runs. But through all, and despite his coward soul, I have brought this blind slave of mine to dare that for which I waited through the centuries. We have come at last to the utter corruption of man. Here lies the first who shall wear my outer livery, because he has worn it once in his heart, but he is not the last. You have said that in the deed about to be performed I break an immutable law, and I know the law you mean. It is the right of the soul, which may not be utterly damned without its own consent. We will test that law. Here, in the person of one man, lies the fate of all mankind, whom I hate. If I succeed, as I shall succeed, then a barrier goes down which has long withheld me from my own. No longer shall I need my blind and foolish tool, who has thought to use my power to further his small and futile ambitions. From that hour I am free indeed. He whose heart I may stamp but once with my seal, I shall claim for my own. All, body and spirit together, as I claim this man. He has slain at my bidding, your perfect one. Protect him if you can. And when you fail, as you must, for you are weak cowards all, who fear to overstep boundaries and lose your godhead, when you fail, think well on this. In the day of the full corruption, and when each hater shall wear the foul outer form of his hatred, who, think you, will be best worshipped of the gods?" There was silence. Then the dull, distant breakers roared again. "I am Tlaloc. I bear the ships of man. My rains water his fields. Shall I serve a race of demons?" "It may not be," Tanathio went ruddy, as if he peered through storm mists. "Shall I behold only devils as the world turns under me?" "It may not be! It may not be!" The cry was echoed by the lesser gods, till one voice sang clear above the rest, the wind's voice, chanting forever round the world. "It shall not be! Beware of me, O mine enemy! I am the lord of the air, without whom no thing lives. Fire, the pure, is my playfellow, and the whelming flood my friend. But ere ever I was a god, I was a man. Man is my brother. Better than all I love him. I am the song of his heart and the strength of his spirit. Courage am I, and hope, and the breath of the wild, sweet places. It is you who have flung down the challenge. It is I who take it up. Beware of me, O mine enemy, for the day of my patience is ended." The singing checked abruptly, and the god's face, bright and fierce even as Tanathio's, darkened, grew dimmer. About him and all of them the mist closed in, obscuring the clearness of Cullen's vision. Like a premonition of evil, the dark mist closed and thickened. When the feathered one spoke again, it was in a mere whisper. Cullen could not be sure if he heard with his ears, or if the whisper and faint answering voice were equally in the bounds of his own brain. "Claim your own, Nakakiotl, but not this man. It is forbidden. You cannot do it." "Why not, pray? One of the rabbits that went to make the stalking terrors behind you could have been no more in my power than he is." "No," retorted that dim voice. "A rabbit, perhaps. Yourself, by all means. But a real man, no." "You flatter him." "Again, why not?" "It won't be allowed, that's all. Were you really the clever devil you think you are, you'd know it." The conversation had taken on a reminiscent tang that puzzled Cullen, and at the same time deeply depressed him. He had an idea, too, that just here someone should come in, and, yes, there lurched Genghis Khan down a lane opened for him between the now barely visible ranks of the gods. Again he was dragging that unlucky and persistent corpse. Having laid it solemnly before the font, he somersaulted off like a black Catherine wheel to vanish in the mist. "Marco, and dead," said Nakakiotl. At the words, a soft, murmurous sound swept the mist, ice-mined mourning through a forest. "Dead," continued the demon, "by the angry hand of my servant." "By the just hand of mine," murmured Cullen's defender. "No, for he knew no reason to kill. I rose up in his heart suddenly, and lo, he obeyed me. Obedience is the test. Why should I not give my servant what form I choose?" Again there was silence. Cullen began to think that to the last question no answer would be vouchsafed, and his depression increased. He would have liked to hear it answered in some definite, satisfactory way that would have convinced himself as well as the demon. But now the vapors had swallowed all the friendly gods save the lord of the air, and his face changed yet more, changed and humanized, till suddenly Cullen knew it for the face of Maxatla, that young captain preferred by the moth girl on Tlapallan Lake. Striding forward, he laid a hand on Cullen's shoulder. "I claim this man," he cried in a stern, sweet voice that was unmistakably human. "I claim him in the name of the feathered serpent. Let any servant of Nakakiotl lay hand on him at his peril." And Nakakiotl answered, "You little fool! Unless you wish to lie in his place, go away. I am tired of having my work broken in on by a silly, superstitious girl. Now, for God's sake, if you know what's good for you, clear out of here and stay out." End of Chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Citadel of Fear by Gertrude Barrows Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Citadel of Fear, Chapter 29, A Golden Flask. The black god's reply to Mixatla struck Cullen as highly incongruous. He wondered what the young captain would say to it, and so wondering opened his eyes. With the suddenness of a blow, the basin, that had been so obligingly transparent as his eyelids, shut in solid around him. The demon face above flashed back into Kennedy's, with its sneer and its enormous glasses. It occurred to Cullen that he had been dreaming. But he did actually lie in that golden basin, and there was actually a hand on his shoulder. By twisting his cramped neck a little, he could see it. If it were Mixatla's, however, that young warrior possessed marvelously delicate fingers. Desiring above everything to identify the owner of that hand, Cullen tried to raise himself. The ropes which had been on his arms were gone, his coat had been removed, and the flannel shirt under it half unfastened. But though free of bonds, he was so weak that the Lord of Fear easily pushed him back and held him there. "Anesthetic wearing off," he heard Kennedy mutter, and then Mixatla spoke again. "I shall not go, not without my lord. Between us there is the golden thread that may not be broken." "What on earth are you raving about now?" "You are as discourteous as evil," she retorted quite calmly. "When first I saw my lord, that night he came to your pitiful fortress of fear, and I knew that its end was destined, when first I saw him in the passage outside my door, great and kind and noble, then I saw that which glimmered between us. Centiodal, who weaves the fruit fields on her looms, spins also the golden thread, for a sign between those who are destined. To not all is it given, but none who receive it may break it. Through all the distance I felt his need calling me." "Distance," sneered Kennedy. "You can't have got very far away from here in that costume." "I have been far," was the retort, given with placid dignity that nothing could shake. "For my dress it was woven for me by the Lady Astrid, my own dear mother, ere she was taken home by the gods. Into it she wove many charms of love, and because of those charms, while I wear it, no great harm may befall me." "Oh, is that why you've hung on to it like grim death all this time? Lord, I never find out anything about your actions without uncovering a new superstition. You'd be an interesting study, if I had time for it. Now, before you clear out of here, tell me in 3 words where you have been. And, by Jove, you know what killed Marco. Or did you do it yourself?" "I had no need, because I spoke some thoughts of him and the vile passion he called love, because I promised to die before I would mate with him. He loosed upon me the devil-man there. So he was slain by one whom my prayers brought to aid me." The leisurely, quiet statement brought an impatient grunt from Kennedy, but for Cullen something at last slid off his conscience that had lain like a deadening weight. Repent Marco's killing? There had been cause, and to spare, for it. He had never supposed that Khan's murderous attack on the girl had not been only countenanced, but commanded. Weakling? So are the rattlesnake and the Gila monster, but men hardly hesitated to crush them for that. Cullen stirred again, and Kennedy's attention came back to him. "You go," he said to the intruder. "I'll attend to your case later. Go, or I swear I'll loose that on you which prayer won't save you from." "I shall not go," she repeated. "Is there no warning that you will heed? Have you forgotten how, upon the first visit of my lord, your fortress of fear quivered, groaning in every stone and timber? To one less blind than you, it would have been sign enough that his coming presaged the end." "You little fool, this house is centuries old. A place so old as this will often shake and settle by its own weight." "You have made it the seat of Nakak-Yaotl, and only a god could shake it. The Lord of the Air is patient, but I think that tonight he will set his foot at last on his enemy's neck. A great wind blows without, a great and awful wind. I tell you, the feathered serpent tears even now at the roof beams of this temple of evil. The end is near, and— Ah!" Even Kennedy started, drawing back from the font and casting an anxious eye about his workroom. As on the evening of Cullen's first visit, a long-drawn, grating moan was shaking the very walls, a strange, ominous, vibrating sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and brought with it a feeling of nausea and vague terror. It was answered by a hideous, concerted wail from the monstrosities of the swamp. At his master's back appeared Genghis Khan, chattering and cringing. Released for a moment, Cullen sat up. Where he got the strength for that act he did not know, unless it had flowed into him from the fragile fingers on his shoulder. There she stood, his dusk lady, the cloak flung back from her beautiful, worn green gown, one hand still laid on her lord, and on her face the look of a pale young prophetess. "Warning!" she cried. "Warning! Maker of hatreds, the end of patience is upon you!" Like a pale young prophetess, the dusk lady stood, but her voice rang on silence, for the groaning sound had passed, and with its cessation the creatures of the mire had resumed their habit of quiet. All seemed as before, save that the swamp's level seemed strangely higher, and over its edge at one side the head of a serpent had appeared. It crept forward a very little way and lay still. Unlike the gatekeeper, this serpent was black with a polished gleam, black like the Teotl, the sacred marble from which had been carved a body for the maker of hatreds. As the sound and vibration ceased, and Kennedy's hasty glance discerned nothing come of them, he turned angrily toward the girl. Then he swore, and a moment later had flung both arms about his resurgent captive. But from some source Cullen had certainly derived an influx of energy, enough at least for a struggle. Kennedy addressed a sharp command to his apish ally, but Khan held off, cowering back toward the dais, and at last springing upon it to crouch beside its deity. Cullen had one leg over the basin's edge. The immense weight of the font prevented its oversetting, but some of the gold containers set on its ledge went spinning down to roll across the floor. After one futile effort to aid her lord by loosening her captor's grasp, the girl stooped for one of these containers. She took it without selection at the hazard of desperation. All she knew of them was that they held stuff of diabolical power, and a desperate woman is not particular about her weapons. She rose, a gold flask in her hands. It must have held about a pint, and it was carved all over with writhing, lizard-like forms. It possessed a crystal stopper that stuck but could be twisted out. She proved it. Meantime, the Lord of Fear recalled that he had other servants than Khan, and raised his head, mouth open for command. It was well for Cullen that in the same moment he had wrenched himself fairly free. Calm as she seemed, his dusk lady proved capable of an impetuosity as unconsidered as had more than once carried her lord into trouble. To fling the contents of a flask at two struggling men, trusting to hit the one and miss the other, requires either great recklessness or supreme faith in one's own aim. But impetuosity for once was justified. Because of his sudden efforts and wrenching away, only a few minute drops of the stuff sprinkled Cullen and they on his hand. Though he hastily wiped the hand on his trousers, it was painful for days afterward. Kennedy, however, was less fortunate. He released his prisoner and staggered back with a short, stifled shriek, and it was the last sound, save one, that was to be heard from him. He had clapped both hands over his face, the human hand and the paw, but not before Cullen caught one glimpse of it. A dripping, darkening, purplish expanse, of which the features in that flash of time had assumed the most curiously blurred appearance. A strong odor as of bitter almonds filled the air. It is likely that the liquid in the flask was what Kennedy had referred to as the second solution. Very probably the application of it in this wholly unscientific manner would not have produced the beautiful results that he so much admired. The question, however, is theoretic, for as a subject of this variation of process, he did not last long enough to be termed a decisive experiment. As he reeled backward, there began a recurrence of that great, inexplicable vibration, and with its coming a wild rage appeared to seize upon the marsh's grisly inhabitants. Transmuted or not, they retained the instinct of beasts to sense disaster, and if they had any share in the intellect of man, they displayed it now by behaving as man does in a panic. The rage that gripped them was of fear, not malice. Archer Kennedy, head in arms, limbs wobbling like an animated straw man's, staggered blindly to the pavement's very edge, and instinctively Cullen shouted a warning. But this third effort to save a worthless life was vain. Out of the rushes beyond, a slimy mass heaved, lashing out with a dozen squid-like arms. It was hard to conceive how such an acephalous mass of squirming tentacles had ever known a master, but the grace to obey was whelmed under now in a more natural instinct. Panic makes no discriminations. Round the Lord of Fear a tentacle whipped, clung and contracted, and as it caught him, a last sound passed what was left of the man's lips. Cullen heard. The word was pitched in a key so low and different from the other noises. God. Prayer, perhaps, but much more likely habit. It was his favored ejaculation. Cullen, who, not being God, could not help him, turned away his eyes, and when he looked back, a score of nameless, fighting creatures were at the edge, with Archer Kennedy somewhere under them, wallowed down in mud. As he had lived, so he died, without comprehension. But he was an empty, negligible thing, and behind him he left the real master, the black, discarnate hate for whose will he had been the blind channel. End of Chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Citadel of Fear by Gertrude Barrows Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Citadel of Fear, Chapter 30. The Gate Lodge Again. "McClellan! Well, upon my word!" Rhodes descended from the car and advanced, hardly knowing whether to be amused or indignant. They had come through Undine a few minutes earlier, and by following the pike had found Reed's place without difficulty. But they were not the first on the scene. 2 cars were standing outside Gerard's ill-omened gates, one drawn up by the wall, the other fairly blocking the road. As Rhodes' car halted, a man had turned away from the first car, and under the road light Rhodes had no trouble in knowing him. The stout detective gave something very like a guilty start, but recovered instantly. "Ain't this your car, Mr. Rhodes?" he demanded, as casually as though their meeting here was the most natural event. The other 2 passengers from Rhodes' car had descended now. "Cullen did come here," exclaimed Cleona tensely. "That is our car that he left outside." "I knew it." McClellan seemed affably triumphant. "Forrester," indicating a second man who had emerged from the car's shadow, "he says she ain't, but you can't fool me on a car I've once rode in. I says—" "Mr. McClellan, pardon me, but did you come out in search of my car, or because you changed your mind about the possible dangers of the house behind those gates?" "Now don't get sarcastic again, please. I'm a conscientious man, and I thought, since you were so worked up over it, we might as well run out and look things over. But seeing you've brought your wife along, I guess you drew it a little stronger than you meant over the phone, eh?" "Tony," Cleona pulled at his sleeve, "my Cullen's in there, and we stand talking." "The gate is unlocked," Bjornson called over his shoulder. "I've left the shotgun for you, Rhodes, and taken the rifle. Coming?" He was already pushing through the gates. "Rifle?" snapped McClellan. "Hey there, mister. I don't know who you are, but you haven't any license to walk in that man's grounds carrying weapons. Come back here." "Mr. McClellan, please, please!" In her distress, Cleona caught the stout detective's hand. "Don't stop us. I tell you, the things may be in there that left that awful trail of blood down our hill. Do you want my brother's death on your soul?" "If your brother had seen fit to tell me of his suspicions," began McClellan, but was interrupted by a series of sharp, quick reports. "That fool!" he ejaculated, and sprang for the gates. But once inside, his intent to check Bjornson and confiscate the rifle underwent sudden alteration. Behind the gate lodge a curious scene was being enacted. The Norseman stood there, beating with the rifle's heavy stock at what seemed a tangled mass of writhing white fire. "Can't kill a thing this with bullets," he shouted against the wind. "Got that shotgun, Rhodes? Quick! Oh, watch out there! Watch out!" The tangle of fire had fairly rolled away from him and toward the drive. An automatic spat viciously from McClellan's hand. He didn't know what he was shooting at, but even his conservatism admitted a need of shooting. Rhodes turned, only to have the shotgun thrust into his hands by an excited little figure that had dashed out to the car and back again while the men were thinking about it. A second later, the mar of a 10-gauge duck gun shattered the night. Rhodes, who had let go with both barrels at once, staggered back, but the double dose of number 4 at that close range had been very effective. The writhing fire fairly flew asunder and quivered almost instantly to darkness. "What is it?" McClellan's voice shook suspiciously. "For heaven's sake, what is it?" Young Forrester, who had stood his ground though unarmed, bent forward. "Some kind of big white snake," he said coolly. "All tangled up with a tree branch. It's still wriggling. Going to plug it some more, Mr. Rhodes?" For that gentleman was hastily shoving fresh shells into the gun's emptied chambers. "No need." Bjornson had stooped for a closer inspection than Forrester's. "It's blown into 3 pieces now. When I came past the lodge," he continued, "I heard a rustle, and then this creature came rolling out the door. Odd about the branch. Look here. The end of it was driven clean through the thing's body, just behind the head. Humph. I wonder who did that now. O'Hara, do you think?" "He would have finished the job, not left the thing alive and dangerous," judged Rhodes. "Alive, but not dangerous. I think this is O'Hara's work." Above them the naked branches lashed, as if blown by the gusty laughter of some invisible giant. The gatekeeper's hard dying fragments writhed feebly, but there was no light in them now. "Golly, watch it bleed," said Forrester. He obeyed his own inelegant recommendation cheerfully, but the others turned aside, rather sickened. "Come away, Cleona," pleaded Rhodes. "Let Forrester stay with you in the car while the rest of us go in. I suppose," he queried of McClellan, "that you are convinced now?" "Guess something's wrong," conceded the detective heavily. "Any man who keeps an illuminated boa constrictor like that in his gate lodge will bear looking at." And just then, through the shouting wind, a mighty reverberation shook the air, a long, dull, roaring sound followed by a kind of tearing crash. Both noises came from deeper within the grounds, and before Rhodes could interfere, Cleona was off up the drive. She had not even a pistol for self-protection, but self was not concerning her. In a rush to the rescue, she no more stopped to consider what she would do on arrival than the Dusk Lady had thought twice before returning here after her lord. The main consideration was to get on the spot as quickly as possible. But, unlike Tlapallan's child, Cleona was followed by human reinforcements. What might otherwise have been a justifiably cautious advance was made at a reckless run that only caught up with its feminine leader in the shadow of the porte cochere. End of Chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Citadel of Fear by Gertrude Barrows Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Citadel of Fear. Chapter 31. A Strange Battlefield. Somehow, Cullen got out of the font and onto his feet. Did the floor really heave under them, or was it the dimness of his brain that made it seem so? "The door! The door!" cried the Dusk Lady, and clutched at his arm to pull him toward it. But Cullen was looking to the marsh. Would its inhabitants regard a former command of their masters as more sacred than his person? They were already at the forbidden boundary line on all sides, and only the fact that they were fighting very energetically among themselves hindered their crossing it. The idea of weaponless flight with such pursuers at their heels was unattractive to Cullen. His eye fell on the spade lying in the golden chest. It was leaf-shaped, pointed, and looked heavy. Rather unsteadily, he made for the only weapon in sight, and in the act perceived a new development. Out of the marsh, not one black serpent but a dozen were invading the solid pavement. They writhed, crept, advanced, flowed into one, and suddenly, under that sinister invasion, a whole section of the floor sank away and was swallowed. Cullen cried out wildly, "The marsh! 'Tis the devilish marsh itself coming in!" But he was wrong. Not the marsh, but what had flooded the marsh was carrying its mire across the floor. The ooze was no longer taking the form of exploring serpents, but coming on in long ripples, like water over breaking ice. And not the floor alone was affected. The old granite piles of the house were sinking, crumbling, while the rotted beams they supported sagged and bulged downward. But another force than water was at work tonight. Above the roofs, like the blow of a giant's fist, something struck the cupola. The candles burning beside Nakhaki-Ottle's dais flickered wildly. Cullen felt a great blast on his cheek, and looked up to see night sky roofing the shaft, stars obscured by scudding vapors of cloud. The outer gale had lifted the cupola bodily, had flung it far and shattered, and its afterbreath struck down the shaft like an eager promise of freedom. The foul mist swirled and cleared. All had happened so swiftly that Cullen, stooping for the one visible weapon, had barely time to raise it before the first goblin brute crossed the line. Combat in the open would have been folly, and sweeping his dusk lady with him, the Irishman made a rush for the doorway. Under their running feet, the floor had a give and resilience like thin, tough ice. Reaching the door, Cullen would have closed it, but lacked time. On the very threshold he turned to meet the first assailant, a thing of innumerable legs, rather like a magnified centipede, but whose head belonged somewhere in the mammalian scale. It was a hybrid of fancy worth looking at, but Cullen was unappreciative. He was very weak, and the spade seemed not only heavy, but heavy as lead. When the many-legged brute came at him, he struck out feebly. It dodged like lightning, came at him from another angle, and the end came near being immediate. But the floor, an inch deep in water now, chose that opportune moment to subside altogether with a long, gurgling swish. Cullen had pushed the dusk lady through the doorway, and himself stood just inside it. The footing there remained solid enough, but the creature of too many legs found itself wallowing in thin mud and much impeded thereby. The floor had gone to pieces under it like a breaking floe. Cullen thrust with his spade, and this time was lucky as to bury its point in one of the beast's eye sockets. It screamed horribly and plugged its bleeding head in the liquid mire. Cullen looked for its mates, but in looking beheld a sight so strange that he nearly forgot the peril. More than the floor had gone under. The font and every other piece of gold in the place was gone, but the dais of Nakhaki-Ottle, with its black canopy, had not sunk. Like a somber islet on a surface of rippling ebony it lay, not floating apparently, but solid as if supported by a column of stone. There still crouched Genghis Khan, and there the black god sat unmoving. But that last was not strange, for how may marble, however sacred, move of its own volition? The strangeness was above the dais, above the canopy. Though the candelabra had sunk out of sight, though the livid vegetation of the marsh had been crushed under the inundation by its inhabitants, the place was by no means in darkness. Something hung in the mid-air now, globular as had been the evil fungi, transparent, pale as the ghost of an old moon against the sky of day, but growing brighter with each passing moment. Hung in mid-air where only vacancy had been. Out of nothing it had come to illuminate all with a sweet light, mellow as a sunset's afterglow. It was bright as a clear winter moon in a black sky, brighter, not transparent at all. A great gust roared down the shaft, circling the dais with the sweep of a whirlwind. It sucked the breath from Cullen's lungs and drove it back again. He straightened. That was clean air. Air to breathe and be strong, but hot as the desert sand wind. That fireball, so mysteriously appearing from nowhere, was giving off more than light. Having passed in a few seconds from pale shadow to dazzling brilliance, it hung less like the moon than a fiery replica of old Sol himself, and the hot wind circled the shaft. "My lord! My lord!" cried a sweet, excited voice in Cullen's ear. "I think the gods battle tonight. The gods! So have I seen T'Nathiu grow to glory in the heart of his temple. The rushing wings of the feathered serpent beat fiercely by. Tlaloc of the floods is with us. But the black god is strong, strong. See how he sits unharmed. The flood may not rise further, nor the fire descend, and his servants lie on in the flood. Oh, my lord! Back there! Get back!" Cullen had wrenched his eyes from the fierce focus of light that overhung Nakak-Yaatl. Whether the Dusk Lady were right or no in thinking this a battlefield of gods, he knew for sure that battle for a man was toward, and that man himself. The liquid blackness before him was suddenly all asplash with swimming terrors. Heads came up at him from every direction, no longer tearing at one another's throats, but reaching toward his with a unanimity of purpose that called for instant defense. The Dusk Lady came of a warrior people. At his rough command, she sprang back out of his way, and the fight was on. The fire globe grew more radiant, the hot, pure wind circled the shaft, and Cullen strangely forgot that he had been drained of strength. In his hands the heavy spade was like a feather, like a living feather of fire, like a sword of fire. There came to him a great joy and exhilaration. He smote and thrust joyously. The strength of 10 was in him, and a vigor that was endless, undying. The great wind circled the shaft, and across the black water, beneath Nakak-Yaatl's canopy, 2 slit eyes had opened wide and glaring in a rage more frightful than any mortal anger. End of Chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Citadel of Fear by Gertrude Barrows Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Citadel of Fear, Chapter 32, The Battle of the Doorway. "Everything's dark as a pocket," complained McClellan, "and this flash won't work. Battery's wore out. Say, Forrester, give me your flash." "He's outside with my wife," said a voice in the dark beside him. "No, I ain't," contributed another voice cheerfully. "Here you are, Mac. Sorry, Mr. Rhodes, but your lady here would come along." A white beam snapped into existence, disclosing a quiet, orderly-looking reception hall. They had entered it from the porch through a door that stood invitingly open, and though Rhodes had begged Cleona to remain outside, and hastily asked the younger detective to see that she did, neither request, it appeared, had been respected. The two had followed close on the leader's heels, and now the whole party stood together near the hall's center. "Don't believe that crashing noise came from here," began McClellan. "Hush," said Cleona. "Listen." "Sounds like a crowd of people yelling from a long way off," Forrester commented after a moment. "From beneath our feet," corrected Bjornson sternly. "And those are not human voices. Say, do you smell smoke? And, say, the floor shake." McClellan's exclamation was drowned in a vibratory roar, like that they had heard earlier, only now they were fairly above its source. Through the heavier noise there ripped a long, shattering crash. Something had happened to the room they stood in. What it was they did not pause to find out, with only a vague notion that in some way the room had become much larger, and that this enlargement, together with the jarring quiver of the floor, meant instant peril. Rhodes fairly snatched Cleona from her feet and led a rush for the porch. They were barely in time. As Forrester, last out, crossed the threshold, a great noise of splintering wood and beams that cracked with an almost explosive uproar followed him. His companions had not paused on the porch, but Forrester was a young man of that reckless sort of cool-headedness which, though it run from danger, will turn again at the very edge of safety. The porch felt solid to him. He instantly stopped there and stuck his head back through the doorway. The reception hall, or rather the space it had occupied, was no longer dark. He had a brief glimpse of a huge open space, billowing with clouds of lime dust and black smoke shot through with ruddy flames. The floor level had apparently dropped some distance and was no longer level at all, but a steep, uneven slant descending to— what? From the rolling clouds a fierce white focus of light shot blinding rays. The smoke filled his eyes with acrid tears, and as he raised his hands to dash them away, crashing doom shot down from above. The end of a flying beam just missed his face, and he withdrew it hastily. "By George!" he exclaimed, "the whole darn house is caving!" and thrust his head forward for further news. Then a heavy hand jerked him away from the door and off the porch. "Come away from there, you fool!" yelled McClellan in his ear. "That wall will go in a minute. Don't you know enough to stand from under when a house falls in? Now you beat it over to Undine and turn in a fire alarm. Phone Deering at— No, phone the Lilybank station, that's nearer. Tell them to chase a patrol load out here quick. Don't wait for them nor the department. Get hold of any men you can pick up in Undine, and axes, and back here on the jump. Got me?" "You bet," came the young man's informal acknowledgment, and he was gone into the darkness. He intended to make his absence from this fascinating scene as brief as was humanly possible. McClellan turned to his companions, only to find himself alone. By the light of a ruddy, sullen glare newly sprung into being, he glanced from side to side, but none of the three was visible. The wall before him had not fallen, but through the open doorway smoke poured, only to be beaten back by the wind. Behind it glowed a redness like the very heart of hell. Never in his life, save once, had he seen a fire develop with such amazing celerity. That other conflagration, though, had occurred in a sash and door factory, and had been encouraged by the bursting of a 50-gallon tank of varnish. One does not expect a stone dwelling house to flare up into easy flame. The roar of the falling debris warned him that other walls were proving less staunch than the one which faced him, but the collapse had begun too early to have been caused by the fire. The entire catastrophe was as incomprehensible as sudden. McClellan dashed off, searching at hazard for the three reckless ones who had come in the car. He had called himself a conscientious man, and it happened to be true. The stout detective felt personally responsible that his party did nothing rash in an effort to rescue that wild Irishman O'Hara, who most likely lay dead now in the flaming ruins. He had half encircled the house before he found any trace of those he sought. To his increased surprise, not a single outer wall had fallen, though the windows, heat-broken now and belching smoke, betrayed what a stone-sheathed welter of flame they enclosed. He knew nothing of the reconstruction that had metamorphosed the Gerard's time-honored residence to so strange an inward form. As a matter of fact, the rear walls of the reception hall and two rooms on either side of it were contiguous to the shaft's inner sheathing, and when the piles beneath finally gave way, that entire wing of the house, including the shaft's side, collapsed, leaving only the outer wall to stand. The two other sides of the shaft overhanging the marsh were not long in following, but the fourth, the solid wall in which was the doorway where Cullen fought, did not fall. It abutted upon a one-story wing built on as an addition, and which covered no portion of the cellar. The doorway led through a passage to a flight of stone stairs, opening in turn upon a suite of rooms reserved by the Lord of Fear for his own use. When McClellan came to an outstanding wing whose windows were dark and cool, and where a low veranda bespoke possible entrance, he had no reason to think this what it was, a point of greater, though different danger than that from which he had peremptorily snatched Forrester. Seeing the figure of a man just disappearing into the veranda's shadow, he dashed hurriedly after him, still bent on dissuasion. It was no use to shout. His voice wouldn't have carried 10 feet in that uproar. Once inside, he snapped on his borrowed flash at the same instant that someone else struck a match. The long, narrow room he had come into was fogged at one end with thin smoke, but McClellan saw at least two figures immediately ahead of him, one of them holding a match above his head and peering anxiously about. Cleona had again played leader, and with such an instinct for directness as had carried her this time clean out of touch with her anxious support. Just as McClellan reached them, his flash disclosed another pair of wide doors standing open in the room's far wall. Instantly, both Bjornson and the lawyer fairly hurled themselves toward that black aperture, and again the conscientious one was forced to follow or give up his mission. He followed. A stone stair led steeply down, ending at a blank white wall. The first two plunged down, their pursuer involuntarily lending the air of his light ray to their descent, but at the blank wall they turned to the left and abruptly disappeared. The stairway was almost free from smoke, but a wave of heat came up from it. It occurred to McClellan that he was quite possibly about to immolate himself at the altar of other people's recklessness. He hesitated. The air shook to a heavy concussion. It came from beyond the stair-foot and sounded as though a bomb had exploded. All three of his party were probably down there. McClellan swore and ran down the stairs 3 steps at a time. He hardly expected to come up them again. The whole house would go in a minute, and the recklessness of people throwing away their lives in hopeless attempts at rescue was very trying indeed to Mr. McClellan. When, a minute or so earlier, Rhodes and Bjornson had arrived at the stair-foot, they discovered that a wide passage opened there, and some 5 yards along it there seemed to be a large rectangular opening in its wall, through which beat a light so white and fierce that even its reflection was dazzling. Dark forms moved against it. The newcomers had hoped for little but to drag Cleona back to safety. But on racing along the passage, they found not one but 2 women at the end of it. And in the center of that brilliant rectangle, a huge wild figure of a man that thrust and struck outward desperately. What he was striking at, however, they could not make out till they were fairly abreast of the glaring doorway. The opening was broad and difficult for one man, however powerful, to guard against such assailants as were besieging it. Even as Rhodes arrived, somewhat in advance, a head came thrusting through beside Cullen and under his guard. It was a frightful thing, that head, slimy and dripping, large as a lion's and hideous as a gargoyle's. It thrust through with a writhing motion, at the end of a neck unthinkably long and snake-like. The once skeptical lawyer didn't stop to consider whether what he saw was possible. Again, both barrels of the duck gun spoke together. That explosion was what McClellan had heard, re-echoed by the walls of the passage, and it announced quietus for at least one more of Kennedy's recreations. Hard dying they no doubt were, but the charge of a double-barreled shotgun at a range of an inch or so is a mighty queller. The neck, with what was left of the head trailing, slid laxly back. Cullen thought the passage was falling behind him and turned, but as Bjornson shouted, "All right, we're with you!" he lunged forward again, content to accept reinforcements without stopping to ask why or whence. Bjornson sprang to one side of him and Rhodes to the other. Shoulder to shoulder they stood across the doorway. The light was blinding and the heat terrific. Half-seeing, they shot and hacked at swimming enemies whose diverse loathsomeness was only equaled by their ferocious determination to pass that doorway. Beyond a 12-foot wide area of hot black water, where the recreations thronged, towered a heap of blazing debris that sent its roaring flames and smoke to the very height of the fortress, sucked up by the rushing wind. At the center of the heap was that fierce white focus of light which Forrester had observed and which it seemed no smoke could obscure. Below that again, it was terribly hard to see anything, but Rhodes thought a darkness was there, as if in falling the beams and walls had made a sort of recess of cavern beneath themselves. And even in the midst of battle, the young lawyer became gradually conscious of a dread worse 100 times than the facing of all the racing beastliness they fought. The fancy came on him that something hid in the sheltered darkness, something living, but that had no right to life, something vague in his thought of a smoke cloud, and definite in terror as the bogies of childhood days. Bjornson shared the impression, but with a difference. He knew that the darkness was a recess, and the recess a lair, and that what peered forth from it lived without the grace of flesh and blood, which made even its distorted creatures endurable to think of. But if there is an evil which is not only of the flesh, so also there is a courage. Knowing, he fought on. Ammunition quickly exhausted, the weapons of Cullen's allies were soon less efficient than his spade. There was little room to swing a gunstock, but now the attack began to seem less vigorous. The black water steamed hot vapor. One or two of the monsters that had been neither shot nor smitten disappeared to rise no more. With scorching face, Rhodes thanked God for the heat, if it were weakening the enemy more than himself. Probably it was because they were in the water and the doorway on a higher level. No, that was absurd. Heat rose upward. The shotgun stock landed fairly on the forehead of a neckless, fat-faced abnormality, with the tusks of a wild boar and a frontal carapace that should have been impregnable. It crushed in with ridiculous ease, and the stock flew in a dozen pieces. Rhodes laughed. He had not struck very hard. The heat was terrific. It had softened the beast's skull, no doubt, and the walnut stock of his gun. With the barrels he foiled a clever, monkey-armed fiend, reaching for Cullen's ankle to pull him down. The barrels, too, bent in shattering that arm. The heat, of course. How lucky it was that he himself did not feel at all weakened, any more than his companions. There was a glorious wind blowing from somewhere, a hot wind, but laden with vigor. Rhodes was conscious of a kind of enormous vitality in himself, as if he were larger than himself, much larger and stronger. His brain swam dizzily, but his vigor was tremendous, endless. Fire, fire everywhere, and he in the midst of it, part of it, elemental, deathless fire. Demons swam in it, drowning, and he struck at them joyously with a sword of fire. But at this point, regrettable to state, the testimony of Anthony Rhodes became valueless, because he was later quite unable to remember what happened next. In fact, since an unbiased account is desirable, it seems best to fall back upon that unprejudiced, if bewildered witness, Detective McClellan. He arrived on the scene only a few moments after Rhodes and Bjornson, and was present at the final attack, and that he adhered to facts in reporting the affair next day to his chief does him great credit. A less conscientious man would have saved his reputation for veracity by lying. "That was one scrap that had me guessing, Chief. I didn't know what was happening, nor what had happened, nor what was due to happen. These three guys stood across the door beating and shooting at something beyond. It was hotter than a river-tug stokehole, and the light was awful. I tried to squeeze in the doorway, but there wasn't room, and those two women were there, and I couldn't get 'em to come away. I'd have gone back afterward, but I wanted to get them out of the house where they weren't doing a bit of good. No use. I might as well have been a phonograph 5 miles off playing the end of a perfect day. Then all of a sudden something come flying through the whiteness beyond the door like a shadow against it, and the next minute this guy O'Hara smashed over backward with a big black thing on him that looks to me like a big monkey. He says afterward it's a live marble statue. Maybe he's Bughouse, and maybe I am. I dunno. There might as well be live statues as some of the other nightmares I saw afterward. Well, anyway, Mr. Rhodes had phoned something about a big monkey out there, so I thought it was that. And here they are, this thing and O'Hara rolling all over the floor together, and me hopping around the outside trying to keep the women out of it, and wanting to shoot, but scared I'd hit the wrong one. Then Mr. Rhodes and this Bjornson party wheels around to see what's going on, and right away there comes scrambling through that doorway an aggregation of What is it? 8-legged, 4-legged, 3-legged, and no-legged. That, well, when I try to think of 'em, I just can't seem to get my mind down to details, Chief. But honestly, Ringling Brothers would have paid $1 million just for their pictures to slap on walls. O'Hara says they were white-colored, and the monkey was white too, and so it couldn't have been the monkey that jumped him, because what jumped him was black. But the whole bunch was so messed up with mud, they might have been pink or baby blue underneath for all anybody could tell. They came plunging through, and Rhodes and Bjornson went down under 'em. I was clean at the passage, understand, trying to keep those 2 women out of it, and we just missed being trampled under. For a fact, the brutes didn't pay any attention at all to us. They weren't fighting mad, they were fear-mad, with the fire behind 'em. I don't know how many there was. There might have been a dozen, or there might have been more. The last one, it was a thing like a kind of spidery cat, and big as any tiger. It jumped clean over the fellows on the floor, and the rash was over, but I could hear the brutes yelling and tearing each other up the stairs, even over all the other racket. I'd emptied my gun as they went, but it might just as well have been a bean shooter for all the good it did. I didn't reckon to see any of those 3 guys that had been tramped under get up again, but when I looked, darned if the Irishman and whatever it was he was scrapping with weren't tumbling around just the same as before. Too busy to know they'd been run over, I guess. And this Bjornson, who, I must say, is one of the gamest old guys I ever met, he was just scrambling up. But Rhodes didn't get up, because he's got a busted leg. Bjornson, he looks around kind of wild, with the blood streaming over his face. And then darned if the old whitehead don't jump into that fight to a finish between O'Hara and whatever it was. I'd shoved a fresh clip in my gun and was willing enough to take a shot, but, say, Chief, if you'd seen that scrap, you'd know why I hated to mix in personally. If I'd see a man scrapping with a full-grown gorilla, and maybe that's what it was, I'd pot the gorilla if I could, but I'll be darned if I do what Bjornson did. As I says before, he jumps right in and grabs the thing around the neck, trying to jerk its head back. He lasts about 5 seconds and then got his. At the time, I couldn't tell just what had happened, but it seems the brute had its teeth comfortably clamped on O'Hara's shoulder and didn't take kindly to interference. It let go, and its head came back all right, and the same minute it gave Bjornson a left-handed sideswipe that landed the poor guy about 10 feet away. Then it got back to business, but just that few seconds had given O'Hara his chance. And I want to say, Chief, that anything I ever said against that big Irish Mick, I take back here and now. Fight. Say, I wish you'd seen that scrap. And in the time its head was up, he got one hand on its throat, and the next minute the other. And, say, Chief, come to think of it, you couldn't strangle a stone statue, even if it was alive, now could you? Mac, said the Chief very solemnly, I am listening to a story on which comment would be, cruel. Proceed. All right, don't believe me then. McClellan's tone was more dogged than injured. I knew you wouldn't anyway, but I have to make my report, and this thing happened just like I'm telling it. Didn't I say at the start I thought it was a gorilla? Though I'll be darned if anybody even saw a gorilla with a face like... Well, anyway, it could be choked, for O'Hara did it. That was when I got my first good look at the thing, and, say, I don't like to think about it even now. Makes me kind of sick. No use. You'd have had to see it to understand. I could have plugged it easy then, but I give you my word, I forgot I had a gun in my hand. I just stood there staring. I wanted to run, and I couldn't. Not with those women behind me. I'd had my arms out, so, keeping 'em back. Isn't it the devil the way women are? If they've got a man in a scrap and think he's getting the worst of it, they'll rush in and never think twice about getting hurt. Back to your animated statuary, Mac. You're wandering. Well, these two had stopped trying to get past me. they were struck still, just like me. He strangled it with his hands, and that's enough said. If it was a bad living, it was a worse dying. I've seen a few messy scraps in my time, but this was different. Can't tell you. Makes me sick to think of it. I was never so grateful to anybody in all my life as I was to O'Hara when he straightened up all of a sudden and dragged that thing up with him and pitched it out of the door. He didn't pitch it any little ways either. It was near as big as him, and he just took it neck and ankles, gave it a couple of swings, and sent it flying across about 12 feet of water right into the heart of the fire. I give you my word, the flames flared up like he'd slung a bag of gunpowder into 'em. Then O'Hara drops back against the wall and starts laughing, like he'd gone nutty. "Claim on me," he gasps out. "Claim on me, is it? The claim that he had is the claim he collected. And I think," he says, "there's one demon will be making no more claims of any man." I tell you just what he says, the detective added rather apologetically, because right then, I guess I was pretty excited myself, but just then it seemed like he'd done something big. Not ordinary big, but tremendous. Like saving a country, or, some darn dangerous thing that everybody ought to pin medals on him for. McClellan paused. "Well," said the chief with suspicious calmness. "Then we got out, that's all. There were some other things I was going to tell you, but I'll be hanged if I will when you look that way. You ought to know me well enough. Wait a minute. Think it over, Mac. Never mind this statue gorilla business. We'll be quite open-minded about that. But could a dozen or so ferocious, gollywogs, such as you describe, have been turned loose last night, and no one, absolutely no one, have sent in a complaint to this office since?" "I didn't say turned loose," retorted McClellan gloomily. "Oh, not turned loose. Adopted as pets, perhaps, by the neighbors? Chief, I'm done. I knew how it would be, but I'm a conscientious man. You ought to know that." "You haven't answered my question." "All right. When we went out, there was a heap of nasty purplish jelly on the stairs, and some more in a room on the first floor, and some more clear outside the house. A lot of people saw it besides me. Forrester saw it, for one. If you don't believe me, ask him." "Oh, I do believe you, Mac, I do. But it's the gollywogs I'm interested in. Where are they?" "All right, I'll tell the rest then. The fire flared up, like I said, and that passage was no place to stop and chin in. O'Hara and me and these two girls, who sure are plucky ones, we carried out the wounded between us. Funny, that was a regular reunion down there in the middle of the fire, but nobody had time to be sentimental then. I told you already that this Mr. Bjornson claims to be the father of the girl everybody round Undine had thought was Miss Reed and crazy. She ain't crazy, only brought up someplace in Mexico where there seemed to have been a lot of queer white people, and her mother was one of 'em. You can get all that straight from Bjornson if you want to. And he says afterward, when he came to, that once he tried to kill O'Hara down in Mex, and here he finds him rescuing this kidnapped girl of his. Or she rescuing him, it seems to be a toss-up which. And O'Hara says he don't care a whoop what happened 15 years ago, just so he gets old Bjornson for a father-in-law now. And a very romantic situation, cut in the chief. But aren't we again straying from our gollywogs? Leave marrying to the minister, Mac, and trot out your animals. Hang it all, you make it so darn hard. I'll tell you in a minute. We got out of the house, and just in the nick of time, too. As we jumped down the steps, there was a flare of flame licked after us that singed the back of my coat. That wing of the house had got so hot from the rest of the place that it must have exploded into flame of itself. Spontaneous combustion, you understand. like the trees do in a forest fire. We get away from there quick, believe me, and then it strikes me as funny that there ain't any string of fire engines around, nor anybody at all but us. I starts cussing Forrester, but 5 minutes later he's with us with bells on and pretty near every soul in Undine at his heels. He says he ain't been gone over 12 or 15 minutes. He was right, too, but it had seemed more like 15 hours to me, straight. Of course, they couldn't do much with the fire, even when the department got there. Besides the start it had, a water main had busted, and they couldn't get any water till they hitched up hose clear into Undine. Well, O'Hara was all messed up, and his shoulder in awful shape, and Mr. Rhodes with a busted leg, and poor old Bjornson so shaken up he couldn't walk. There was a doctor came over from Undine with the crowd, and he fixed him up temporary, and having 3 cars handy, it was no trouble to get him home. I says hospital, but they were all set on going to Rhodes' place, so of course the doctor and me gave in. I wanted answers to a few questions, so I went along, and just as we pulled out, they got the water on the fire at last. But O'Hara says to me, they'd best let her burn out, and at that the ruins of it should assay 50-50 pure gold and devilishness. I wish joy to him that gets it. I says, I'm proud to have known you, Mr. O'Hara, but I wouldn't want any gold that came out of that cellar. And he says, you're a man after my own heart, McClellan, or you'd never have been in at the finish like you was. It wasn't gold that drew you, he says, and I know fear didn't drive you. And as the same may be said of all of us, I'm thinking Mr. Kennedy was mistaken. For a man to judge the whole world by himself is a dangerous matter. But, he says, the Black God was another matter entirely. And then he goes on to tell me all that had happened to him before we arrived. It was like this. McClellan, snapped the chief, are you or are you not intending to answer my question? What became of the animals you say escaped ahead of you from the cellar? The stolid detective clenched his teeth despairingly, but dared evade no longer. When Bjornson came to, he muttered, after we got him out, he says those heaps of jelly we passed on the stairs and round were the gollywogs, as you call 'em. O'Hara, he talked to the fellow that was killed, one of the 2 fellows, Kennedy alias Reed, and claims they've been turning common, harmless rabbits and cats and such into jelly life that, and then making 'em over into these regular hellions of brutes. And Bjornson figured that when O'Hara choked the life out of Nakok Yottle, or some darn name they teed the statue by, the beasts all slumped back into jelly again. I tell you, I don't say anything's true, but just what I saw with my eyes. Exactly, and now I no longer blame you, Mac, for darkly concealing the gollywog's sad fate. So you go home and go to bed. End of Chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Citadel of Fear by Gertrude Barrows Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Citadel of Fear, Chapter 33, as One Triumphant. And here, rightfully, the story ends, with the end of what was either a very singular biological experiment or the most extraordinary and sinister invasion by which the race of man was ever threatened. The rest is all surmise, conjecture, the muddling work of many divergent minds. The burning of the old Gerard place, together with what was later found in its ruins, and the strange story of the fire survivors, caused considerable excitement at the time and started some controversies of which the ripples have not yet quite subsided. The unpleasant heaps of purplish jelly outside the house had rotted clean away by morning, and had been absorbed by the earth past analyzing. It seemed probable to the world at large that the jelly, if it had ever existed, had no connection with the beasts, admitting that they had existed, and that the latter had perished in the fire and been utterly consumed, even to their equally problematical bones. The fact that 2 alleged human corpses had also vanished could not, however, be explained in this manner. O'Hara testified that the bodies of both Markazuma, alias Marco, and Archer Kennedy, alias Chester T. Reed, had sunk in the flood, one having been already lifeless and the other perishing beneath the fury of his own handiwork. It seems to reason that bodies immersed in mud or muddy water would be safe from the incineration. A number of other things were found in said mud, but no bodies. Ergo, Mr. O'Hara was mistaken. No bodies had ever been there. By part of his own testimony, he had spent at least a portion of his evening's captivity in a dreamy and semi-conscious condition. No doubt this accounted for much that was, well, slightly incredible in the Irish gentleman's testimony. The lady from Mexico, too, was no doubt pardonably mistaken. In moments of excitement, delusion is easy. The Irish gentleman, for instance, believed that he had broken Marco's neck 24 hours previous to the fire. No doctor was present. He merely assumed that the man was dead on the strength of his own unprofessional judgment. What more likely than that? O'Hara's back turned, Marco rose and walked away. And Kennedy, in all probability, escaped from the burning house alive and comparatively uninjured. Quite likely, master and man were now in hiding together, and it was recommended that the police bestir themselves and rout them out. Sven Bjornson, however, disagreed with the world, though he confided his opinion to none but sympathetic ears. He based it on the fact that every one of the jars, boxes, and other golden vessels dug out of the mud were found open. Even he declined to surmise what force had opened them, and thus destroyed every particle of their diabolical contents. But for a time at least, the flooded cellar must have been highly charged with the stuff. He knew for a certainty that, exposed to air or impurities, it lost power quickly. The men who dug in those ruins were safe enough, but to Bjornson it was not strange at all that no bodies were found there. They were present, but dissolved as utterly as though the mire had been a kind of temporary quicklime. There being no corpus delicti, Cullen was spared a trial for manslaughter, justifiable or otherwise, and it cannot be truthfully said that he was sorry. He and his dusk lady were really very much in love, and it is a pity to be wasting time in jail or law courts when one wishes to be on one's honeymoon. As it was, the investigation was tiresome enough. It ended at last in clouds of doubt, with a few bright spots of definite decision. A burst water main was found to have caused the flood. That, together with the weakening nature of the building's reconstruction, had brought on its sudden collapse. And the insurance people, after deep pondering, set down the fire as resulting from faulty insulation and crossed wires, a favorite explanation for otherwise inexplicable conflagrations. As to the Golden Temple vessels, the state fell heir to them in lack of any other claimant. They may be seen today in a certain national museum, though their value is considered dubious. Authenticity as Aztec relics has never been properly established, and their gold was found to be a thin coat laid over solid copper. Besides them stands an object of still more dubious value, a black stone, in fact shapeless, yet with an odd suggestion of having once possessed a shape, as if the marble of some old, wicked idol had been melted in a hotter flame than science has ever fanned to being. But there is nothing terrible about it now. It is just a black stone. Of course, it may be that McClellan's first surmise was correct, and that Genghis Khan, magnified and distorted by excited imaginations, was the antagonist conquered for a second time by Cullen. Certainly the pseudo-ape had crouched on the dais, and when it grew too hot beneath the fallen debris, such a brute could have leaped the intervening 12 feet of water as it had leaped the forest glades from tree to tree. At the time, Cullen himself believed otherwise. To him the whole matter seemed simple enough then. A demon had claimed him. He had conquered the demon in a satisfactorily personal manner, and as to fire out of nothing, flood that wrought swift miracles, and whirlwind that lent the strength of a Titan with its breath, why, he had never denied that under the Almighty were powers of good to aid a man as well as evil to crush him. Having met nothing to shake his faith in either his universe or his God, he remained a good Catholic, and the Dusk Lady was duly baptized into that church, loving her lord too well to quarrel with his religion. But though he is sure of her love today as he was then, he is not so sure of the nature of that last battle. After meeting the 1,001 contemptuous arguments hurled at their heads, he and his companions became at last sure of nothing about it except that he strangled something and flung it into some kind of fire. And so, of the most somber actor in a very strange drama, little remains but a shapeless stone and an uncertain memory, and that ever growing more dreamlike as it recedes into the past. But on that night of nights it was not like a dream at all. It was clear, clear and bright-like, as had been the sight of Tlapallan to Cullen. And when those six first emerged from the burning fortress of fear, they had no more doubt of their adventure's sinister nature or of its reality than they had a few moments later of the last strange sight of all, though that was more glorious than sinister. It was a vision all shared, from McClellan, starting on an angry mission in search of Forrester, to Bjornson, just opening his eyes, safe and with his daughter's arms about him. They were among the trees then, some distance from the house. Rhodes lay groaning with the pain of his broken leg, and Cleona had his head in her lap. Cullen, very sick and dizzy, with a mangled shoulder and various other wounds, was leaning against a tree and wondering how a man could have the strength of 10 one minute and be weak as a kitten the next. And then it was that McClellan stopped in his tracks with a sharp cry of amazement. The others looked where he pointed. Above the fortress of fear the fumes roared high. In a lull of the gale, fire crested it with a fuming tongue of scarlet. And as that fiery tongue soared skyward, a vast, diaphanous form plunged through the lashing tree branches, plunged through and up, and flung itself on the flame that bent roaring before it. A vast, impetuous shouting form, of turbulent plumes and a face of undying youth. Quetzalcoatl, Lord of the air, the wind, the victorious wind. Ah, that pure and violent one, gently, patient, and fiercely intolerant, breath of the wind, sweet places, enemy to all foul vapors and morbid vileness. Great deeds he chants of, and hope, and the courage that is not only of the flesh. "A heathen god, but a staunch friend," muttered Cullen. "I'd be less than a friend myself if I did not admit that I like him." Bending, the flame streamed out like a banner. As a trailing banner of scarlet plumes it followed the shouting one. The end of Citadel of Fear by Gertrude Barrows Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.